3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Day for the Dog Trainer Podcast, episode 204. Today, we get a guest here. We're being joined by Leandro of Merge Canine in Barcelona. You guys know that we did an episode with him back in March. It was very popular. It was entitled The Nerdiest Podcast on the Planet or something stupid like that. So we're getting him on for part 2. Let's do it. My parents are actually in Las Vegas right now, and they told me yesterday it was like 104 out there.
Jesus.
So, no thanks. Not a heat guy.
But I heard in it's a desert, right? Like at night it should come down a little bit, no?
It cools down a little bit, but it's still pretty hot. So yeah.
Real quick before we get started, let's just run through. I think I should be able to.
Yep.
Or you might have to give me permission to share.
Yeah, let me do that.
My screen. Or maybe I already do. So I send request. There you go.
Yep. Beautiful. Look at that. You should be good to do a screen share now. Also, by the way, the other person on here, Josh, that's my guy that I do the podcast with. He's just recording everything on his end right now. So if you see his name pop up.
So are you seeing the shared screen at the moment?
Yeah, I can see it.
Cool. Real quick, we just go through. Okay. Is this going to be then recorded onto the pod and people can see it?
Yeah.
Or is it something we're just going to, okay.
No. Yeah, this will be recorded so people will be able to see it. I don't know if you have the ability on your end as we start going through this to kind of like zoom in on particular sections because it's pretty small,
for sure.
Obviously, but
it's pretty big anyway. I'll hide it for now.
Yeah.
Since we don't really need to see it the whole time. Just wanted to check up if we could do that. And hi, Josh. Last time I think he wasn't on it with us, was he?
No, he was not. Yeah, he wasn't here for that episode, so he's here now. Josh, you're welcome to if you want to do your.
Yeah, man, chime in for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Put the take this. Oh wait, can you hear him talking?
You could probably hear me through your computer, right?
Yeah, I can hear it through your audio.
Say, if yours was turned on, we would get a lot of feedback. I think. So.
Yeah, we would get like double.
So, Josh, if you want, maybe you could, if you want to turn your video on, do you want to? It's up to you. I don't care.
Good question, Josh. How do you feel now? Like, do you feel like you're basically a dog trainer at this point, right?
Turn your freaking camera
Okay,
on,
all right.
Jesus Christ.
All right,
come on. If you're going to be on the pod, we might as well see you and talk to you directly.
All right.
Look at this. This is like the first 3-way Zoom call on the podcast. And he's sitting right across from me right now. Look at that.
Hi, there we go.
Hey, man. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. I find myself like when I have friends that have anything to do with dogs, I kind of like have to put my 2 cents in now. I'm like.
Do you actually do that?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I'm like. I do a podcast with a dog trainer, so I kind of, but that's I would say I'm a very rough cut, normal person that I have a slight experience, Do
you have any so you work the audio and the video, right?
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of similarity between, say, the technical side of working audio and video for, say, a podcast and something that you can sort of compare to dog training in some way?
Oh, man.
You're getting hit.
Yeah, he's grilling me right now.
Let's go.
I think it's cool because at the end of the day, like you have shared knowledge that can apply to both things. Yeah. And if you're gonna help in this aspect, right? Like you have the technical know-how to do this, you can easily apply it to dog training as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I can attribute the both together, I guess, would be
recording in progress.
Sorry, I was just making sure. I don't know what you're doing on your end.
Oh, okay.
I didn't hit that yet.
You're scaring me here.
Right. Sorry.
No, you're good. But I don't know. I think the big thing is experience. The thing that I've noticed a lot, especially with dog training, is you just have to do it. You could take all the classes in the world, but it all comes down to experience at the end of the day. And it's the same thing with me. It's like, I just picked up a camera one day and said, hey, I'm going to start doing this. And there was a lot of trial and error. And, actually, we've been talking. I don't know if you listened to the Flexi Lead.
I heard a little bit of it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we talked about that. Like when I first started working with him in 2018, Flexi lead, we hated it. We hated everything about it. We talked so much crap on it, and then now it's like we've seen that it can be a great tool. So I think if anything I can give to that is just experience over time and figuring out what actually does work and doesn't work and what's the myths, if that's a good one for you.
No, for sure.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
That's dope.
Awesome. Well, listen, man, appreciate you coming back on.
Mm-hmm.
I know
My
we've
pleasure.
planned this obviously for a little while now. What's new on your end? Anything?
So we hooked up in beginning of the year, for the first round.
It's like March.
Since then, I've been to Japan for like 2 weeks. I finally graduated university, so I now have my Bachelor of Science in Sports Psychology, 100%. Good news on that end. I think I got what's it called? Unweighted GPA was like 396. It's like pretty decent score.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So I'm hyped on that. That'll help me for my future endeavors. So I'm still like in this sort of intermingling period of deciding, well, should I go further into sports psychology? Should I just go straight into psychology, like a general therapist type, or maybe even couples counseling? So couples counseling seems like an interesting one for me. I like it. So let's see. I might go into that as well. Or just go straight experimental, like just go straight into doing experiments, lab work and stuff like this, publishing papers and so forth. But that's further down the line.
Yeah. So obviously first off, Josh, that was him basically saying he's way smarter than us.
Yes, yeah.
No, please.
I was like, all right, I'll see myself out.
Yeah.
No.
I don't ever have the ability of like flexing my schooling scores because they were so bad. Okay, so obviously like you have those career paths right now. So where does dogs fit within that currently?
So currently, I had to write about this when I was like about to graduate as well. They're like, well, what are you currently doing in your day-to-day life that sort of applies to the stuff you've learned in university and so forth? And it's kind of why we started our first conversation, right?
Yeah.
So basically, dog training is 100% oriented around two very important figures. They weren't necessarily, like, for example, Pavlov wasn't a psychologist. He was actually studying the gastric system of animals, and then he kind of stumbled upon the whole thing. Skinner comes in at a rough time where psychology still isn't really psychology. They're still sort of dabbling with stuff, and if it weren't for people like Skinner, the radical behaviorist types, we wouldn't have psychology the way we know it today. So yeah, I mean, that's all sort of intermingled, right? I end up seeing behaviorism and the concepts in play day to day, right? Because I'm working with dogs and I have to motivate people as well, right? So it's both.
I meant more so like, where do you see it fitting as like a career path with you, right? Like obviously you want to move in the direction of, following what you're studying currently, right? And obviously you're training dogs actively, and I understand how they intertwine together. But like for you, do you envision yourself working with dogs like long-term forever? Yeah. Or is this a way to continue to kind of just keep broadening your knowledge of psychology and stuff like that,
I'd say I've had this like thought in my head for a while now. It's like, well, if I just go straight in all psychology, how balanceable is that, right? It's like at some point, if you're fully delving into, let's say, the experimental side and you're working in labs and all this sort of stuff, it's basically a full on job. You're there like all day, basically. And then managing a dog training business doesn't sound so easy anymore.
Yeah.
So my sort of future orientation would probably be doing as much of both parallel as possible.
Yeah.
To the point where I can enjoy the nice stuff of dog training and the nice stuff of psychology, whatever realm that ends up in.
Yeah. Yeah, and like clearly there's a lot of like very successful people in the like studying of like animal psychology too, where if you get into more of an experimental side, I'm sure you can kind of figure out a way to blend them into the same career to some extent, which could be cool. Like you seem like you have just as deep of a passion about like learning the whys behind things and studying things in dog training as you do probably actually hands-on, like working with a client and like helping them with their own dog. So, I think a lot 100%. Of people in your position probably find themselves in that crossroad at some point where it's like, do I do more of the like working with client side of things, or do I do more of like the studying dog training side of things, you know?
Actually, like maybe an hour ago before getting ready and setting everything up here, I was watching there's a new podcast with Michael Ellis and what's this guy's name? The Yorkshire Canine Academy guy. I can't remember his name.
Yeah, I don't
know. Sorry, can't remember your name, guy. And he was sort of asking Michael, because they were sort of doing this Q&A thing about like just mostly from other dog trainers towards Michael, basically, right? And they were asking sort of like, well, how come a lot of, let's say, normal dog trainers end up going into sports, for example, and then never come back?
Yeah.
He was sort of hinting at the fact of like, we would love information, more presence from, say, someone like you, Michael, or someone like you, Ivan, right? Sort of these people, they're sort of so far removed.
Yeah.
And how come that happens, right? And Michael sort of made an interesting point where he was saying, well, if you're really interested in the nuances, the complexities, the deepness of dog training, you end up just moving further into that camp anyway, because at the end of the day, it's not the same working with people who are equally as motivated as you are to do insane things as working with just your regular down-to-earth person from wherever who just needs to solve problems with their dogs, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective where it's like, I'm curious to hear your opinion on this, but like, if you're only working with clients, right, I feel like you will to some extent always hinder I don't know the best word for it, but the excellence of what training can be, because you're always limited to the skill set of the people you're teaching it to. You know what I mean? So it's like, I have kind of accepted this with myself where I feel like I could talk about deeper concepts in dog training a lot and stuff, but like, interestingly enough, and I've had people, you know, random followers on YouTube and stuff comment this before, who maybe found me through the podcast and then started watching videos of me, you know, working with clients. And they were like, okay, well, you talk like somebody who's in the sport world, or, you know, really scientific and this and that. But then we watch you working with clients and stuff is more sloppy. It's not as like, you know, what they would expect, you know, from somebody of a higher skill set of things. And I've just kind of accepted that, like, when I'm working with clients, my priority is not doing really excellent dog training from the standpoint of like it being super precise and like training in all of the proper ways for the dog and this and that. And I'm more focused on just ease of use for the client. So I think that was kind of like word vomity, but like, you know, I think that's kind of what you're alluding to, or Michael was alluding to, when he says you want to get more into working with people that are like-minded so that you could level up your training to that, you know?
Yeah. And then you have the other side where I've heard Ivan Balabanov say like, oh, you came to train for sports and you just want to treat it like playing tennis in the weekend.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can also be frustrated on that side as well, depending on the case.
Yeah.
To answer your question, or to add to it rather, at the end of the day, it really falls down to us, the dog trainers, right? Yeah. So you might have a client that you've brought up who is super interested in this sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And when I say this sort of stuff, I mean the more nerdy, high elevated sort of content regarding dog training. And you definitely should indulge them in that. You should motivate them to pursue that if they desire to.
Yeah.
I've had a couple of instances of like that where, to name one, for example, I had this guy who had this super reactive like Malinois who had like puppy who had like bit like 5 people by the time it was 5 months or something.
Yeah.
And I like met him one night walking. I was coming back from a bar and he was walking the dog at like 2 a.m. because there's no other time that he could walk the dog. Mm-hmm. And I had too many clients, so I referred him to another dog trainer friend here in Barcelona. And he enjoyed training so much with this dog trainer friend of mine that he then decided to take a course with him and became a dog trainer.
Yeah.
Right. So that's an example. Or I have a client, shout out Kelly. When we started with Kelly and her Weimaraner, stuff was going completely wrong. And now she's super, super smart at solving problems on her own. We see each other maybe once a month or every so often, just because she's in my, my club members program. So she gets like free follow-ups every now and then, whenever she decides to book them. And man, she's coming to me solving problems already. Like, hey, let's catch up on the class and let's do this. And like super intricate healing processes, reward delivery, this, that, the other. And she's in it now. Like she's in this matrix, but she didn't start there. You know,
Yeah.
All this to say, if I see the right person,
sure,
if I see the right interest, I'll push, right? I'll definitely push. And then there's other cases where I have some older lady, 50 plus, 60 plus, whatever, and all she cares about is her chihuahua not barking at everything. Mm-hmm. Right? And then I'll dumb it down. And I'll just be like, cool, this is how we resolve this, da, 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 da. And it doesn't even have to go there because she's not interested. She just wants to solve the problem and not necessarily understand more in depth what actually happens.
Yeah. That makes complete sense.
That's cool.
Yeah. So I used to, before I got into dog training, I used to play music and used to be in a band. And I regularly find myself, having conversations with clients randomly in lessons where we're just chit-chatting, right? And they're like, oh, what did you used to do or whatever? And I'll kind of say, yeah, I played music, I was a musician. And they, they're like, oh, what did you play? Like guitar, this, that. And they're like, oh, well, do you miss playing guitar? And I always say, and I'm sure I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I always say like, for me, playing guitar, and I'll tie this into dog training in a minute, obviously. For me, playing guitar wasn't about like deeply loving the process of playing guitar, right? Or the nuances and the technicality of it and stuff like that. Like obviously I enjoyed that and it was cool, but for me, I really liked building something, right? And creating something that people enjoyed. Right. So because of that, my answer to that question always is I could scratch that same itch with dog training because I'm doing two things, right? I'm building something. I'm building a company, obviously. And then in addition to that, I'm creating something that's helping people, right? So I tie this into it because like to this conversation we're having right now about like, your skill set and working with clients and this and that. For me, dog training, like I personally, and again, I'm okay with this, like dog training to me isn't about like being the greatest dog trainer ever and like being of the same caliber mindset as people like Michael and Ivan and guys like that. Obviously, it's about helping people. So that's kind of where I'm getting at when I say like, I'm okay with like, understanding concepts enough to have good conversations about them and like having enough skill and enough knowledge in order to help people as effectively as possible, obviously. But like that, I guess that's why I don't really have the urge to like get back into sports and stuff is like, I don't need that in order to scratch that itch. That's not my driving factor for what I'm doing. You know what I mean? So I don't know.
That's an interesting take. Yeah, for sure. It's interesting, right? Cause like who's the overall determinant of what should be, right? Yeah. It's like, I know that's a really deep philosophical question, but like there is sort of this thing nowadays where we could even sort of place a judgment on what you just said and be like, no, but he's wrong because he should be interested in the conceptual side, right? Because everything's marketing nowadays, right? Someone could grab that clip and be like, no, he's not the best. He clearly just said he doesn't want to be the best, so he's not even good.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. It's like...
it's the focus of it. You know what I mean? Like for me, like whether in dog training or in music, like I wanted to be the best band, right? And like get the most attention and get the most, you know what I mean? But like, it didn't necessarily mean I had to like care so much about being like as quote unquote like technically precise as possible with things. Where same deal, like I want to help my clients as best as I can, where to me that doesn't necessarily also mean that I have to care, the focus is on helping the client, not so much being the most technically sound with things, right? And obviously you have to balance it out. You got to care about both, in order to help the clients the best. But I think there's a difference between people that care predominantly about the technicality of things versus people that care, predominantly about the result, if you will. Does that kind of make sense, I guess?
For sure. Actually, it just made me think about something regarding music. So you've probably heard, or if you've watched like some Rick Rubin interviews.
Oh, yeah.
You know who Rick Rubin is, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's very adamant about like, never think about your fans. Yeah. Don't think about anything other than what's in front of you.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next point. At the end of the day, I personally view it like this. Either you're thinking art or you're thinking dollars.
Sure.
Basically, right? So in my opinion, or at least the way I sort of, my worldview, so to speak, there is compatibility between the two.
Of course, yeah.
But one will push you more in one direction versus the other.
Yeah, but then we could get even deeper with it and go like, okay, like art, right? Like, what do we define as that, right? Because like art to me also isn't the technicality and the preciseness of things, right? It's what's the most appealing to the individual. So like I can even say then further, like, and I feel like the music example is the easiest to discuss this, but like for me, it's not even like, oh, what am I producing something that's going to, generate dollars? But it was like, am I producing something that I truly like enjoy? You know what I mean? Like I really like this thing. So if I am only focused on creating something that I genuinely think is good at that point, like hopefully that translates to other people. And same deal, I could look at my clients then in dog training and say, I am producing a result that me as a dog owner, it's convenient, it's easy, it fits within my life. So I could then have a higher probability of saying, okay, my clients are going to feel that way as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, fair enough, right? It's like we could argue that even though, going back to the first example, even though Michael Ellis doesn't have a huge social media presence and all this sort of stuff, his sort of mission is to bring as much info about dog training as possible to the people that want to consume it, right? Which in turn creates dollars.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's still really artful.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. He's not necessarily thinking about, oh, this is going to make me the most money.
Yeah.
He needs to survive, clearly, like we all do. So money is a factor, but the mindset behind it is, how can I just create the best thing possible and really regard the attention to detail to the most amount of things that will create the best outcome. Right? Yeah. And I'm sure you did that with your music as well. I'm sure a lot of people, even underground musicians who haven't made it yet, are also trying to aim for the same thing. I think we're all aiming in some regards to the best output we possibly can generate.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm kind of thinking about like, as I'm talking out loud, right? Like what is your take on the whole, like, so what I said a minute ago on what is the balance between predominantly caring about the success of your clients more than the technicality of things versus caring about the technicality of things and the success? What do you think the balance of that is? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, at what point does it start becoming like, okay, you're caring too much only about the success of your clients and not about how you're doing things, right? Versus you're caring too much in the other direction. Where do you see that balance being appropriate for you?
Oof, and then we could even add another dimension of your own moral compass and ethics.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's why some people decide to only train positive only, and that's their marketing strategy as well. And then there's other people who are like, yeah, I don't care how the dog feels. E-collar strapped on, prong collar, he's not pulling anymore. Bat.
Yeah.
And then you get the result. The dog's not pulling, but it's destroyed.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word. So maybe there you can even sort of start looking at that mix. It's like, well, how technically gifted are you at not creating an immense amount of fallout so that you can have quick results for your client?
Yeah.
And how forthright are you at proposing to your client, hey, this isn't going to take one session, for example.
Yeah.
I've been sort of writing a lot about this recently, where like I currently think dog training is at this weird stage right now where, because it's mostly unregulated and we're now adding laws on top of it, like governmental laws banning different breeds, banning different tools, etc. And there's no clear cut technique to follow to get a result, right? There's a color palette of options that you can choose from to create an end result. And then getting to your point, how technical do you want to be? How precise do you want to be? Is it just important to deliver the result to the client? And that whole thing needs to start being discussed more, I think, in depth, and even at a governmental level, if we really want to make things nice.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if I can give you the best answer possible on what I think should be the perfect balance. I think, like I said earlier, if your client wants or is inclined to want to know the why behind things and is also interested in how to make more elaborate behaviors occur and so forth, I think you should also be adequately trained yourself enough to be able to provide that for your client.
Yeah.
And if they don't want that, then you should also just give them that and not let your ego determine what you're going to give them.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Right?
So, okay. So I guess I'm trying to find I think this is a really interesting conversation, and I'm trying to find a way where we could talk about it in we're not super hypothetical ways, obviously. Right. So let's dig into a little bit. This is a conversation I've never had with anybody else really in depth, but I hear a lot of people talk about this concept of destroying a dog with the overuse of force and pressure and things like that. And, you mentioned it a second ago, right? Where do you think that comes from? And do you think it's really just a use of too much use of aversive causes destroyed dog? Or do you think what do you define a destroyed dog as, I guess, is where I'm going with this.
And this will sort of tie us in perfectly to
Yes.
the stuff we want to talk about later. I personally view the use of aversives, if you don't have a plan on how you're going to use it,
Okay.
and you don't have a plan for how the dog can use that information, right? All you end up really doing, if you overdo it, is you limit options for the dog. You haven't taught the dog what to do with this information, and now you're just creating confusion and fallout and so forth.
So is that
To the point...
Go ahead, sir.
Sorry, to the point where the dog doesn't know what's the escape, right? What's the intended thing that they can do so that they can avoid the aversive, for example. And that's so they don't have an option to get out of it, one. Mm-hmm. Two, because now they don't have an option, they start offering other things, which is also not the thing you want. So now you, let's say, punish on top of that. And now you just limit. And your dog says, okay, I'm not going to try anymore, done.
Yeah.
Right? That's the extreme case.
Yeah. Do you view that as just improper use of aversives or just overuse of aversives? Because I feel like those are kind of two different things. Let's use your example of the healing, right? You said, okay, a trainer might go in and all right, e-collar, prong collar, correct the healing, stop the healing, but then you have a dog that's, shut down or destroyed, right? And I'm paraphrasing what you said, obviously. To me, your definition you just gave a second ago would be slightly different than that, because if you're training using, let's say you want to train, healing or whatever, right? And you're using negative reinforcement in order to do it. You could use all the pressure in the world, but as long as you're doing it with a plan and in a way where the dog is understanding how to then escape it, right? Would that equal destroyed dog still or shut down dog still? Or would that just be you used, aversives in order to quickly train a heel position? Do you get what I'm saying?
Well, the difference there for me is to quickly train a heel position versus to properly train a heel position. Mm-hmm. And I know we're getting a bit nitpicky now, but even though a lot of European trainers, I mean, there's still some out there who show it publicly, high level, right? Mm-hmm. They use tons of aversive tools for really high level behaviors, and they're using it sometimes a lot, but it's integrated into their training strategy in a way that doesn't create a negative outcome, right? So does that constitute overuse? If the end result is a dog that looks like this, just tail up, no ears pinned, no, what's it called when they're stress yawns and stuff like that, the classic stuff that people like to look up online and be like, oh, the dog is panting too much, it's stressed.
Yeah.
It's like, man, it might just be hot. Or I had it the other day, posted some clip, and my dog was lip licking. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Why? Because it was about to get rewarded afterwards. Mm-hmm. It's not stress, right? It's just actively okay, cool. I know that the reward's coming. I'm licking my lips in anticipation, right? Anyway, to get back to the main point.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily overuse if the end result is proper. We can deem it proper. We say, okay, this dog looks great, actually. It's not shut down by any means, and it's active, proactive, and wanting to work with us, versus the other case, which, again, I think it's less and less nowadays, but we still have some trainers out there who are like, okay, like I said, prong collar, e-collar on, boom, 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 and dog just says, okay, I submit. Mm-hmm. Right? And then you could say, well, the dog's walking next to me, aka heel, project done, pay me. Right? That's for me where the distinction is. And it doesn't necessarily matter for me how much you use it. It matters more how you use it.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out what my follow-up question is to that. So how do we differentiate, and this is probably directly starting to tie into what we're going to talk about, but like, how do we differentiate between like, so you use negative reinforcement to train something. Let's say we want to use negative reinforcement exclusively, right, to train getting onto a bed or something. And you're going to use an e-collar to do it, right? Engage e-collar pressure, turn it off when they get on. Engage e-collar pressure, turn it off when they get on. Like,
sorry to cut you off. Are you so you're free shaping it? You're not using any food at all. You're just eat a stim on.
Well, not free. I mean, you could give. Let's say you're giving direction with a leash as well. I mean, it's still negative reinforcement, right? Like but you have some way to like show them how to escape the pressure in a relatively timely fashion, right? But you're not. Yeah, you're not using any positive reinforcement or anything with it, right? We're just going to exclusively use negative reinforcement in this case, right? And like, there's if you're not implementing positive reinforcement into things, there's very few circumstances where you're going to avoid probably a temporary, the dog being like, I'm not entirely sure what to do. I'm going to just stop for a minute here because like nothing's happening when I'm on this thing, but I'm still not 100% certain that being on the bed is what alleviates the pressure. You know what I'm saying? And like through trial and error and repeated repetitions, you'll probably find that the dog will start becoming more confident in one being on the bed is what's escaping pressure. And then they'll probably make periodic more mistakes to continue to solidify, you know, their understanding of the bed being what's alleviating the pressure, right? Yeah. Or using the example of the heeling, like you put the prong and e-collar on, you train using exclusively negative reinforcement, the dog being in the heel position, and you have that temporary, we could call it the dog submitting, we could call it the dog shutting down and just maintaining position, but still not being 100% confident that that's what it is that's alleviating the pressure. And that's kind of how I look at like shutdown, is like that in-between period where when you're utilizing an aversive to train something where the dog is doing the correct thing, but not totally certain that it is the correct thing. Does that make sense? That's kind of how I, you know, generally speaking, will view like a shutdownness, if you will, right? Where was I going with this? So, okay, so I feel like if you're exclusively using negative reinforcement, it's very, very challenging to avoid that period, right? Of the dog not understanding that. And that could tie into like, okay, well, like, is that the right way to do it? Is there a way to do it where we could avoid a little bit more of that confusion by training the behavior first, et cetera, et cetera? But I guess my question is, one, do you disagree that if you use exclusively negative reinforcement, that, you know, it's very challenging to avoid that temporary gray area of the dog not fully understanding? And if you don't disagree with that, does that necessarily make that an incorrect way of doing things? Does that make sense?
Well, okay. So because negative reinforcement has two sides,
yes,
escape and avoidance.
Correct.
Escape is the first one that you're mentioning.
Yes.
It's where I will offer something to just turn this thing off, right? Mm-hmm. Once the dog is in avoidance, or once it's reached avoidance, better said, now the dog has a solution.
Correct.
Right? Usually in trials, in experimental trials, they do this with rats, and they present a tone that the rat, in this case, will acknowledge is the thing that comes before XYZ stimulus.
Yeah. Which would be the command, correct? Like when we're training dogs,
for example.
Sure.
Right. So in your case, like, you can sort of apply leash pressure to a dog to sit. It might take you a while if the dog doesn't know how to already do it. Mm-hmm. And the dog's just like, bro, chill.
Yeah.
Right. Eventually it sits, pressure turns off. And now if the dog, but that's the thing, right? If the dog already knows what sit is, mm-hmm. then it's way easier for him to avoid the negative reinforcement.
Sure.
Right. So it's like learning on top of learning.
Yeah.
The way most, or at least the dog training I like, the way most modern dog training that I like works is we aim to teach dogs all the behaviors possible first, mm-hmm. through positive reinforcement. And like we get them extra hyped for the things they like. We get them like 10 out of 10 flying into behaviors, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can start adding more stuff into it. The next level to that, though, is, well, what if when I'm doing my luring and I'm really proficient at my luring, let's say with like flipping into heel, what if when I'm doing my luring, I also have a prong collar on and the prong collar is doing the same motion as my hand for the luring? Now they're together at the same time. The prong collar isn't over dominating the positive reinforcement. It's just there together, right? So we have to be really fine mechanics as a handler to be like, okay, we're not going to overdo it. We're not going to underdo it either, but we're just going to implement it in there so that the dog has knowledge of both, right? So that the negative reinforcement is accompanied with the positive reinforcement at the same time. And so then it's easier to transition into just using negative reinforcement. And you can completely avoid, pun intended, avoid the escape portion of escape and avoidance.
So
if it's done like that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, I understand. Obviously, if you use positive reinforcement in conjunction, if you train the behavior first, if you then go do your escape training of like, or your avoidance training or escape avoidance training of like, okay, we say bed, right? Dog gets on it. We've taught it with positive reinforcement a bunch. Then we say bed. The one time the dog doesn't do it, we engage negative reinforcement, release negative reinforcement. Obviously, once they get on, yeah, you're probably going to have less repetitions needed of using negative reinforcement than at that point. I guess my thing is like, is there what is using that? There's a lot of trainers right now I see that are promoting the use, and trainers that are like well-educated trainers. So like, let's take. Are you familiar with Ivan's new student, Dylan?
Yeah.
So I like his work a lot, right? I really enjoy the stuff he's putting out. I've referenced him a couple times recently on the podcast because he's really started developing a big name recently. And he talks a lot about, predominantly exclusively using negative reinforcement at this point to train, right? So I guess I get back to my question of then like God, I'm trying to figure out exactly how to ask it because like so what's the hack of using negative reinforcement independently while avoiding the temporary dog kind of awkwardly maybe shutting down a little bit and figuring out what they need to be doing? You get what I'm saying? Or is that still unavoidable at that point? And then is there an inherent, are you going to do long-term damage by properly doing exclusively negative reinforcement and working the dog through that stage of things? I guess I'm tying this back to the whole like destroyed. I hear, Larry's a guy I've talked about a lot who always talks about, people are destroying dogs. And I think, the overuse and improper use of aversives, you could have a dog that's just forever shut down and never escapes out of it because they never know how to alleviate pressure. But going through the stage of a dog learning how to work through pressure and work through that shutdown period, and then coming out the other side confident in the expectation, there's a lot of thought to that being good for the resiliency of dogs, and maybe doing all of that like pre-work to avoid the use of aversives isn't creating as much resiliency as we want out of them.
I don't disagree, nor do I don't necessarily disagree. Let's start there. Yeah, anything hard in life creates resiliency if you survive it, obviously. Great example, going to the gym. Or in your case, like we were talking about earlier with music, if you're an actual, let's say, selling artist and you have to put out albums and stuff, you have to also go to the studio and just work it out. And you're going to have shitty days. And you're just going to have to sit there and figure it out, right? And I think through that process, you realize how to move quicker, more efficiently, come out of it stronger, and so forth. However, I don't like to place any sort of moral judgment on whether we should or should not, like as if we can say, well, the dog should go through hardship.
Yeah.
Like,
that's a good
sure,
point. Yeah.
They sure, should. Yes.
Yeah.
Like, sure, yes. Sure. Why not? They will inevitably anyway through nature. Yeah. Like, I've had this discussion once with some person on the street, because here in Spain, technically the tools I use are not fully legitimate. there are licenses. Thank you. All good. And someone's stopping in the street and they're like, oh, how come your dog is like walking between your legs all the time, has no freedom, all this stuff. And I'm like, look, if it were up to me, dogs would just live through, what's it called? Just through evolutionary terms. Like, they just be free and whatever happens, happens. But there's cars, there's people, there's other dogs, there's other animals. And like your dog will inevitably come up with challenges. And if it's evolutionarily stable enough to procreate, then it will pass through. If not, not.
Yeah.
Right. And we noticed this. It's like dogs don't have a concept of, oh, that's a car. It might squash me. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. That's also that's also stuff that people forget. It's like, if we don't do anything, the dog will be faced with challenge at some point in its life.
Yeah.
And it can turn out good or it can turn out bad. So to that point, sure. Should the dog go through hardship? Sure. Yeah. I also don't like the idea of like, well, I'm using positive reinforcement also, and therefore there's no fallout, there's no nothing, it's all happy go lucky.
Yeah.
It's like, no, like I was saying earlier, let's find a way to systematize things so that we just get the best result.
Yeah.
Right. We talked about this last podcast. I'm really, really nerdy about the sports world.
Yeah.
Specifically because there's contingencies placed on behaviors whereby a judge is looking at your dog. Not only did it do the behavior the correct way, but does it look good? Is the dog like amped? Is the dog doing stuff all the way? Right. That's the cool part for me. But you can't necessarily just get there by negative reinforcement alone. Right. You won't. Like most people in the sports world, like high performing, high level performers aren't just training their dogs through negative reinforcement and stop.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So there's a balance. It's like, should you eat a lot of chocolate until you throw up? Yeah. So that you have to figure out that you shouldn't.
No, this is a good point though that you're bringing up of like, the attitude you're not going to get maybe by exclusively using negative reinforcement, and whether you're using traditional positive reinforcement or not, like let's say you're training downstays, right? And you're training downstays with negative reinforcement exclusively back to, right? And you're not going to create the enthusiasm out of it. You may have a dog that like neutrally understands what to do, right? And gets into the down and knows how to avoid the pressure and isn't overly stressed about it and stuff. But they're not going to be like amped out of their mind, right? But then if you start adding in like environmental positive reinforcement, for lack of a better word, and start pairing in, all right, well, now we've trained this downstay with negative reinforcement, and now I'm going to start making my dog do a downstay before I let them go run in the field every single time, right? Then at a certain point, you're going to start to get the enthusiasm out of them, but it's just because those things that you're asking them to do are basically like these contingencies that lead to going and doing fun things at that point, right? So I think that's like, Ivan with all his play stuff and everything, he doesn't use a lot of traditional positive reinforcement from the standpoint of food and everything, but I think he does create these strong, good working relationships with his dogs through obviously play and more like environmental freedoms and stuff as his rewards at that point. I guess the reason why I was asking all the questions though initially on like the negative reinforcement, good, bad, in between, is because I guess to say frankly, like I like with my clients, like I train, come, obviously I don't train heel, but like I train my come command, which is my walking position, pretty much right out of the gate utilizing negative reinforcement and utilizing either
I watched that video the other day.
Or a prong collar. You know what I mean? Yeah, that was obviously me talking about my philosophies on the come command in general, but like when I work with clients, like I pretty much right off the rip will train it utilizing just negative reinforcement. And I guess I'm just pushing back a little bit on you used that as an example of like something that kind of destroys dogs in your opinion, right?
So in your
and I don't
case,
think you're necessarily.
I don't think.
I don't think take it as like a personal attack, obviously, but like I guess to get as direct as possible with it. Like I do that, and this is exactly what I was talking about how trainers will listen to my podcast and then go watch a YouTube video and see me train healing or train the come command or whatever, utilizing any color and negative reinforcement like day 1 or day 2 with the dog, and be like, what the fuck? I thought you were this guy that loves sport dog training and does all the, and like cares about the deep science of things and stuff. And I just don't, I don't view that as a problem, assuming you are following the principles of negative reinforcement properly, and you have, I think you said, a plan in place and are teaching the dog ultimately how to avoid the pressure with things, right?
Right, correct. I was more so making an allusion to, sadly, I still see this a lot here in Spain, and I hate it. Just, let's say, trainers who, they get a new client, pop a slip leash on, whatever, and it's just like, let's go for a walk.
Yeah.
Without a plan.
Yeah. So,
right?
So what about, like, when you say about without a plan, elaborate on that. Because again, like I said, like day one, if I get a client and that's a massive puller, day one, dog will come in for first session. We'll put, depending on what tools they already have on currently, we'll either put an e-collar on them or put a prong on them. And we will like establish the walking like immediately. You know what I mean? So, but I guess, you know, the plan is I know I'm going to be able to do it in a way where I don't need to correct the dog anymore for it very quickly. And they will learn that they can avoid the pressure by doing A, B, C, or D thing, obviously. And then, you know, they, you know, very quickly after that, because they're not getting corrected repeatedly for it, become more confident in the expectation, et cetera, right? So when you say without a plan, what do you mean
without
by
a
that?
plan, what you're saying is, by my standards, fine. Let's show the dog what the negative reinforcement is about and then how to solve it. And in your case, that's what I liked about your video is you're like explicitly not making contingencies super hard to achieve.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Right? You're just like, look, if you're here in this bubble, even though some people would argue, well, dogs don't understand gray behavior, they understand black or white.
Sure.
To give you your credit, in your case, it doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah.
Because the dog is somewhere here. It just knows the pressure will turn off when it's here in that bubble. Doesn't matter if it's next to you, behind you, in front of you, and then when you start walking, the same contingencies take place.
Yeah.
So you have a plan. You understand how that's going to play out, right? What I don't necessarily like is this old school mentality of like, well, let's show the dog what's up, and then you just go out and hammer it.
Yeah.
Right?
Or you have a reactivity for all
reactivity
sorts of random shit
for everything. And then let's say, for example, you have a dog that's a puller, and it's a puller because it's also reactive and stressed out of its mind.
Yeah.
And then now you add a e-collar to it, and you take it out for a walk, sees a dog, you go, and then boom, and then the dog is just like, whoa, what's going on? Right? That, in my opinion, is what creates the fallout. It's when you have too many behavioral issues together that you might want to address separately to create better communication. And then maybe later you can add the things in where people are just, sorry.
No. So
go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, I understand what you're saying now, because that's another thing that like we push against, I will say, is like we'll have people that'll, same deal. The dog isn't used to getting corrections for things, right? They haven't really used aversives with them before. And then they'll get an e-collar and suddenly they got their laundry list of like, all right, jumping, counter surfing, getting into the trash can, barking out the window, picking socks up off the ground, whatever. You know what I mean? There's a laundry list of like 6 different things, and they're going to right off the rip implement punishment for everything all at once. And though, again, eventually, hypothetically, once you chip away at each one of those and stop them all, the dog should learn that, they'll probably have that period of really shutting down initially, because it's like, I just got corrected for 15 different things, right?
Yeah, for absolutely everything.
For absolutely everything. But like at a certain point, they'll kind of come out of their shell enough to like try something and not get corrected, and then try the jumping again and get corrected, and start realizing, jumping is definitely off limits. And then they come out of their shell a little more and pick up a sock and get corrected. Picking up the sock is okay. But you're going to have a much more prolonged period of being shut down as they work through that than if you just picked one thing at a time. It's like Ivan's example of you go in the kitchen and you touch the toaster and you get shocked. But as soon as you realize it's the toaster that does it, you're not walking around the kitchen all stressed out, where if you touch the toaster and get shocked, touch the stove and get burnt, grab the coffee pot and, melt your hand off for it or whatever, you're probably going to just avoid the kitchen altogether, because there's too many things at play all at once and you can't figure out exactly which one's correcting.
But doesn't that take you longer then as a trainer to solve if it goes wrong?
Say that again.
So say, for example, my dog jumps over the fence in the front yard and it barks at other dogs. And because it barks at other dogs in the front yard, it jumps the fence. Now, let's say one of these trainers I'm referring to, right? They go and they just hammer the dog the second it's in the yard getting kind of hyped.
Yeah.
Boom. And now the dog doesn't want to go in the yard anymore. Mm-hmm. Now that's going to take you a lot more work to be able to bring the dog back in to the yard first, and then solve the things that you wanted to solve anyway.
I'm trying to figure out which example like that I used you're kind of referencing with that. Are you talking about correcting a bunch of things all at once or just one thing at a time?
So if you correct a bunch of things at the same time that overlap in an environment, right, then, and the dog doesn't have the skill, adequate skill enough yet to understand what the correction is for, then you do maybe sometimes run into what's it called, superstitious association.
Oh yeah. Right? Okay, no, I agree completely. Yes, yeah, and that's why. Like, let's take fence reactivity for example. Like dogs that react in the backyard. Usually, before I ever start correcting the dog for fence reactivity, I'll usually ask the client, okay, does the dog just bark at the fence, or do they like jump on the fence and bark at the fence, or do they run over and try to bite the fence, or whatever, right? And usually before I go in, because I say this all the time, I don't know what your opinion is on this, but like correcting for like arousal behaviors, I think it gets a little bit gray sometimes, because it's like, you know, barking at the fence versus whining at the fence versus, you know, it's like, where can the dog differentiate that difference in arousal? You know what I mean? Where like if they react at the fence line and jump at the fence, I'll generally tell people ignore the like reactivity or the barking or the whining initially, and just make sure the dog realizes jumping on the fence is off limits, right? And I'll correct that thing first and do that for like a week or so until the dog's no longer jumping on the fence, and see what kind of reduction in like overstimulation and arousal that I see, because the dog's practicing better self-control, right? And usually what I'll find is then most of the reactivity is gone at that point, because they have to keep themselves a little bit more mindful when they're out there near the fence line. And generally speaking, I don't run into that, the dog's hesitating on going into the backyard, because they're usually pretty able to correlate, like, oh, I'm running over to the fence, I'm barking, but when my paw touched it is where I got the correction, right? It's a very clear black and white kind of expectation in their mind that they could figure out pretty rapidly. But yeah, if I was correcting the jumping on the fence, and then they stopped jumping on the fence, but they were still barking, and then I corrected them for the barking, and then it's like they ran halfway towards the house and then turned around and let out a little huff, and I corrected them again for that. Yeah, at a certain point, they're going to think it's just being in the backyard, which will then take longer for them to loosen up and really become solid in what the actual expectation is. So I think that's what you're saying, and I think I agree.
And I mean, it ties further into like where we started, right? So you have the adequate skill as a trainer, also because you have delved into the sort of sporty stuff and the sort of more conceptual stuff to understand, well, how does my timing influence decisions that are going to be made? Right? How long, like, how should I wait between things? Should I correct the arousal itself? But there's tons of trainers out there who don't get that.
Okay, so we found our line, kind of, right? Like, so I would say that, like we've talked about this before, with positive reinforcement, we don't want to say that there's no fallout when you're training exclusively with positive reinforcement, because we as trainers know that there is potential fallout that can come from it. And a lot of it, I think, is more big picture fallout, right, of the overall well-being of the dog and stuff like that. But when you're utilizing aversives specifically, I think we could all agree, if we're being honest, that when you're training with aversives, you run a higher risk of fallout if you're not doing it properly. And though I don't necessarily think, this is why I always push back on the destroying dogs thing, because, like, again, I don't know what your opinion is on it, but I've worked with some dogs that have been through some really fucking shitty training programs before, and getting back to the resiliency of dogs, like, I think most dogs can rebound really quickly from like really shitty training programs as soon as they become solidified in how to escape or avoid the aversives that are using, right? But we have to have the baseline level of knowledge enough to properly implement those methods in a way where you're not going to create as much fallout, right? So we can't define exactly what that line is, obviously, but yeah, I guess if you're training with aversives, you should at least understand the concepts of negative reinforcement and positive punishment well enough to be able to implement it properly, which, yeah, to somebody like me, or I'm sure somebody like you, it's like, duh, right? Like, common sense, like, you should be able to figure that out. But that I don't want to stray too far away from what we wanted to talk about today, but that ties us into this next thing, which is like so many, I mean, there's a reason why the e-collar conversation is so big right now, and everybody's talking about how it's being done and the different ways and you know, activation or conditioning or this or that, because like I just genuinely feel like so many trainers don't understand those two concepts of learning. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, the hard thing I think is these tools, also just a prong collar, the way it looks.
Yeah.
The fact that the e-collar has electricity, even though it doesn't function so rawly.
Yeah.
Right. It's not so raw as like we're just shocking the dog. There's levels, all this stuff. Like there's so much depth, even just analyzing the tools themselves.
Yeah.
There's still too much messiness in the dog training industry where it's like, well, some people will just strap the e-collar on, bing, bang, boom, job done. Then there's other people, like the classic debate with Larry and Ivan, whether you should precondition it with a positive marker, this sort of stuff. Then Ivan coming back, well, it's unnecessary. Like there's still too much debate among these tools. Yeah. And what ends up happening from the outside is the governments and other entities look at us like we're dumb, basically, because we're just fighting amongst each other.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of us kind of are, but that's okay.
I mean, I think we're already at a point in dog training where we could solidify sort of like a strategy that everyone could follow. That even if you are dumb, it won't destroy your dog.
Yeah.
I think
which would just be
teaching.
There. Would it just be teaching the proper application of those methods? I mean, again, we already kind of talked about the quadrants, and how you have a little bit differing views on, you know, how the quadrants are and stuff. But is it really just like making sure people actually understand how to use positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment? Like, if we just did that as a baseline, wouldn't we be so much further ahead than we are right now?
As just a baseline, for sure. But then like the sort of more complex stuff, to your point, it's like the timing.
Yeah.
Right? Where are you doing this?
Yeah.
Are you just doing it at your house? Are you like, some people will be like, well, cool, my dog barks at the dog park. Let me just take my dog to the dog park. I know about negative reinforcement and positive punishment. Dog park, boom. And now the dog hates other dogs, hates the dog park, hates the park where the dog park's at, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just because they think they understand positive punishment and negative reinforcement.
But wouldn't that be an example of improper use of it, though? Right? Like, so
100%.
Let's say that, right? Like, so like the only way you would create a dog that like hates other dogs and hates going to the dog park and this and that would be by improperly applying positive punishment, by trying to work through that, or negative reinforcement, or whatever it may be, right?
That's the thing, though. Those people probably think they know.
Well, yeah, no. I'm completely agreeing, but that's what I'm saying. Like, that's what, at a baseline, we got to make sure we solve that problem first and foremost. I feel like, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a big push, especially now in Europe, where like governments are forcing people to take training courses before they even get a dog.
I saw that.
I'm not against it. The only part where I'm against legislation is like, well, who determines what that course is?
Yeah, that's kind of my whole thing with it. Like, anytime I like have conversations with people discussing training methods or like debating or whatever it may be, I would say I like to debate the proper application of things, right? So how we're talking about, like, okay, well, that would be a misuse of positive punishment or a misuse of negative reinforcement or whatever it may be. I hate getting into, I'll have fun conversations about it, but I hate debating the more moral side of what's right and what's wrong, because it is just so goddamn subjective. You know what I mean?
Yeah. 100%.
So listen, this has been great so far. Obviously, we got a bit of a topic we want to get into, though, I think. So why don't you?
We have a pretty big one.
We got a pretty big one. So where do we want to start with this? Do you want to lead this off?
Here, I'll just
Josh,
share
how you doing over there?
I'm good. What would you guys name the first one?
Like the nerdiest podcast ever.
Yeah, this is definitely part 2.
Yeah, like the conversation up until now has been pretty mellow.
Yeah.
In comparison. So let me just put this full screen. Let's start by defining some terms. It's lagging ever so slightly. There you go. So there's a few here that we don't necessarily need to talk about, but one big one for me in this whole thing is autonomy, right? Autonomy is the capacity for an organism to act within its own self-direction, right? Which, going back to your point earlier with negative reinforcement, when the dog has no sense of autonomy over the outcomes, that's where fallout happens.
Sure. Okay.
Right? When it doesn't know that it can change its situation, and anything it tries to do to change that situation fails, the dog loses autonomy.
Yep.
Right? Which creates the inevitable fallout that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's short duration, long duration, or endless, it still creates the same thing, and it's all because of lack or having of autonomy.
Do you feel like, I don't want to jump in too much here, but do you feel like the same can be said with positive reinforcement? Do you think there is a segment in the dog learning how to access positive reinforcement where the dog doesn't feel like they have autonomy?
Yes.
Or because they're constantly trying to access something because it's like a different part of the brain, do you feel like that wouldn't apply there?
So the next term, competence, ties into this.
Okay.
When we first start using positive reinforcement, the dog has very little understanding of how to access the reward, right? It doesn't have actual competence in achieving said reward. It's just sort of going by instinct. And that's why we're here. That's why dog trainers exist. It's so we can guide the dog the best way possible to reach that outcome so that they start developing more competence to reach that reward, right? That's like the classic use case where we say, don't name it till you love it, right? I wouldn't name the sit the first time I ever lured my dog into a sit.
Yeah, they're not competent.
Unless I know that I can reproduce that a million times and the dog's going to do exactly the same.
Yep.
But we all know that doesn't necessarily happen, right?
Yep.
Motivation, we'll get into, like, it's not super important that we define it, but what I did want to define, and that's why I put them separately, is we can talk about motivation generally, right? The state that energizes the behavior, the psychology behind motivation. And then we have the subject motivation, which can be food or escaping an aversive sensation, right? That's the subject of motivation. And so sometimes we talk about motivation as both things combined, right? And it kind of gets messy. That's why I wanted to sort of split them in two. Mm-hmm. This is something, the next one, prediction error.
Before we move on from that one. So motivation as its baseline is a state that energizes and directs behavior, modulated by reinforcement history, context, and perceived control, right? So the dog is in a state of motivation. They're in a state of wanting to seek out some type of whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Or to seek out some type of motivating stimulus, right? And then the motivating stimulus is the object, event, or state that gives rise to motivation. So it's the thing that creates the motivation, what the organism wants, seeks, or is driven by in the given moment. Okay. Am I understanding? I'm just making sure I'm following along.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Again, you're smarter than me, so.
No, you got it 100%. I just wanted to sort of mention it that way because sometimes in conversation, just the same way we say pressure for negative reinforcement.
Yes.
And pressure has like this moral thing to it. And like, if we can just define stuff, this is like the Alex Hormozy thing. He's let's just define everything as baseline as it can be. And let's get rid of all the confusion, right? Yeah. So in this case, there is a subject motivator and there is just the intrinsic, the actual psychological state of being motivated.
Yep.
Right. There's two things. It's like when you look up a dictionary definition, they'll be like noun, adverb, verb for the same word, right?
Yep.
That's what I want. That's what I was intending with that. Then there's also two definitions for prediction error. There's the classical definition for prediction error, and then there's sort of the revised one. They both mean the same thing. It's just basically when something is expected to occur and when something that is expected to occur doesn't occur. I've heard you talk about prediction error. I think it was the last podcast, maybe.
A couple ago. Yeah, two or so ago.
Yeah. So you know this already.
Yep.
I just sort of wanted to write in the Schultz definition, the second one, because he's sort of talking more about dopamine and stuff like this, whereby the first definition that came up didn't really focus so much on dopamine. It was just sort of more focusing on expectation without much more, right? So then when Schultz came in, he sort of looked at the dopaminergic spikes that occur when prediction error occurs and when a cue means something that doesn't later occur and so forth. He sort of studied more the dopamine reaction. So that's more so neuroscience versus psychology.
Yep. So I just want to, before we move on,
sorry.
Just for the people that are listening, I just want to kind of read these out here. So obviously the first one is the difference between what the organism expects to happen and what actually happens. Learning occurs when this error is present, either because something unexpectedly happens positive or something expectedly fails to occur negative. And
Correct.
the example that I used in the podcast episode we did that I think is one of the best examples in this is like when you're clipping a dog's nails and they have a negative or adverse, association within the past. They got, quick. Do they think something really scary is going to happen? And each time you successfully do it where nothing painful happens, a prediction error is occurring, which is shifting, obviously, what the dog is thinking in that moment. Again, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, and if you did clip the nails and you went too far, and the dog felt pain, then it would be a positive prediction error because in its head it was expecting there to be pain, and then there was.
Ah, okay, yeah. I never really associated it of like, so that's just reinforcing the prediction. Then at that point, is that kind of what you're saying?
Correct. So if something you expected to happen happens, then positive prediction error occurs.
Yeah. Cool.
Sorry, am I going? No, I'm correct. I'm correct. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. And then obviously Schultz ties this in with then dopamine and cortisol and how that also affects what happens during prediction.
Yeah, which is dopamine neurons fire in response to prediction errors. Initially, they fire when a reward is received. Later, once the organism learns that a cue predicts the reward, they fire at the cue instead. If the expected reward doesn't arrive, the neurons pause firing, indicating a negative prediction error. Got it.
Correct.
All right.
It's an important topic that we'll talk about later.
Yep.
And then lastly, I wanted to sort of differentiate between what Skinner calls operant behavior and what I'm going to be calling operants. So Skinner never coined the term operants, but operants is something that is talked about in dog training circles, and it's not necessarily scientific, but does have some roots in the same science that applies to Skinner. So I'll read that real quick.
Yep.
Operant behavior, as per Skinner, is behavior that is emitted by the organism and whose future frequency is modified by the consequences it produces. It is not elicited by a specific preceding stimulus, but shaped over time through reinforcement or punishment. Mm-hmm. And operance is an organism's capacity to act upon the environment in a way that produces meaningful consequences, reflecting the behavioral potential shaped by learning history, reinforcement, and environmental feedback. Representing the functional quality of behavior, a measure of how effectively an organism can operate on its surroundings, whether through strategic action, avoidance, or approximation. Mm-hmm. So to break that down real quick, Skinner argues that all of our behavior is cause and effect, right? I argue, and a lot of dog trainers who've been around for a while and have noticed this effect, I think I mentioned this in last podcast, I argue that once the dog is fully aware of how the whole quadrant thing works, they're in a sort of matrix, mm-hmm. right? So they know now that their behavior can elicit consequences. Mm-hmm. It's not like they're waiting for consequences to happen and they're adjusting to the consequence. They are proactively creating the consequence.
Sure.
Right? Whether it be through avoiding, through strategic action, or approximation, right?
Yeah. And that's where you tie it all back to the autonomy, is they hit a point where they're
Correct.
Autonomous
Correct.
To be able to seek their rewards or, avoid their punishments. So.
Mm-hmm. And autonomy and competence always together.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And then the last one, and this one's something we might define or we might not define in this podcast.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I would probably want to start first. I've heard different dog trainers mention, well, dog's lacking behind a little bit, pop him a little bit on the leash and activate him forward.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Then you have the, I can't remember the gentleman's name, the guy who was representing the Nepopo camp.
Curable.
There you go. Yeah. He argues, technically speaking, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what the takeaway there was, if you add positive reinforcement to negative reinforcement, the turning off of that pressure is positive. So therefore, negative, positive, positive.
But that's the confusing thing. He was arguing that the pressure starting was positive, right? Which to me, then at that point, like, I don't know if you have a definition for activation yet, like in your head, but for me, it's always been just either a cue or it would be basic. I think technically speaking, activation per the way they describe it, my understanding of it is you're basically just training that the stim is a cue.
So everything is a cue all the time.
Sure.
Technically speaking, everything in dog training and in life is a cue.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what we want to do about it. Cause like I always tell all my clients, and we did some seminars recently as well. Pavlov has like, he's the puppet master.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you want it to be. It's like gravity. Like classical conditioning is happening all the time.
Yeah.
There's very, very, very minute ways to sort of circumvent it, but if something repeats itself over and over again, it's going to get classical conditioned.
Do you view markers as cues?
Yeah.
Okay.
I view commands as cues. I view commands as markers as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, for example,
would the difference...
if you...
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
If you only negatively reinforce a sit, since the beginning of creating that behavior, and now you say sit, 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 it's like tapping prong, 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 prong.
I could get that. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
Whereby the opposite is not true. If your dog doesn't have the balance, right, autonomy and competence of knowing what to do with a sit, and you stopped halfway through the training, like most people we get as clients, they say sit 7 million times and the dog does nothing, right?
Yeah, but
the opposite isn't true.
But the finished product with negative reinforcement, using the example of only negative reinforcing a sit, I'm assuming you're talking with the prong collar because you use the example of pop, 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 right? But if you only ever negatively reinforced a sit, ever in the history of training sit, in the initial stages, so the front end of negative reinforcement, obviously, where it's the escape side of things, yes, I would agree with you that every time you say sit, the dog is going to predict the pressure coming, so it's the same as getting popped. But on the back end, once they learn how to avoid it, technically, shouldn't that not be true?
What should not be true?
That sit would be like pop, pop. Every time you say sit would be like pop, pop, pop.
Technically, yes, unless you do it over and over and over and over again, because then you're just conditioning that nothing's going to happen. That's prediction error all over again.
Yeah. So wouldn't that then the use of negatively this is great because this is kind of tying into the initial thing I said about using like e-collar with the bed or e-collar with the heel and stuff. Then wouldn't we be, when we're using negative reinforcement in order to train something, wouldn't we be then, initially, obviously, as we're training that sit cue, basically creating like almost a punishment marker out of the sit cue initially, but then once the dog learns how to avoid it, then creating a prediction error that obviously ultimately will lead to the dog just knowing that sit doesn't predict an aversive. Sit is just a cue to sit down, right? And isn't that why a lot of people that do escape training exclusively with dogs will recommend teaching the escape prior to adding the cue to it? So the same concept, don't name it until you love it, right?
Makes sense. The thing is, how does that look like when you put competing motivators into the picture?
What do you mean?
So in isolation, sure, the dog understands this is a cue for sit and nothing will happen after that, right? That's the avoidance side. But when your dog is distracted and there's other stuff around it and you're asking it to sit, it's harder for him, right? Mm-hmm. And now you have to repeat the word again, maybe, or you do have to add negative reinforcement to make the thing happen. Right? And so now the prediction error goes back to 0 again. Meaning it starts all over again, right?
Yeah.
Because then the consequence still is the outcome.
Yeah.
And then we go into this loop whereby let's say I trained sit with negative reinforcement in my kitchen, and then it got used to it, all good. Now I go to the park. And then I go to the park 12 more times until the dog doesn't have to use the negative reinforcement again. Sure. But then you'll have that same loop somewhere else.
Yeah.
As you escalate in difficulty.
So isn't the same, though, if you used positive reinforcement to train it and then used negative reinforcement to proof it 1 or 2 times on the back end? Couldn't we say the same thing then?
In essence, that's always happening with learning, right? Yeah. Like if you train something in isolation, you will have to then proof it somehow. And negative reinforcement is a great tool for proofing and generalization.
Yeah.
Right.
So are you saying the same, though, in that case, though, the sit command would become, a conditioned punisher, if you will?
It can.
I don't disagree with that, obviously, but I
If you want, we can just skip. We can skip right ahead.
Yeah.
We'll get back to this later. So I have this sort of diagram here. Zooming. There you go. So common use case of markers, right? Mm-hmm. Like if we've trained a dog to sit, What comes after sit? Yes, reward.
Sure.
Or good, right? Good. Like good implies stay in position, delivery service to you if you stay.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
That's how most people do it. Some people also will say, I've heard Pat Stewart, he says, he'll just say the word again, right? So he'll have the dog sit, and then he'll positively reinforce the sit by saying sit again.
Yeah.
Right. There's different philosophies there.
Yeah, that's a whole separate conversation, isn't it?
But he's sort of tapping into this already. So if I have to negatively reinforce my dog into a down, right? There's prediction error always happening, and there's classical conditioning always happening. So on one end, when we're in the teaching phase of a new behavior, like down, in this case, the cue triggers a mechanical sequence taught through luring that indicates imminent reward upon completion of the mechanical movement sequence.
Sure.
Right? Later through inhibition, right? So we say, okay, now the reward isn't going to come the second you sit anymore. It's going to come later, right? So we start sort of elaborating this process. That's maybe when we add our good marker, for example, and then we start solidifying that behavior. Now we move into somewhere where there's competing motivators and we have to apply negative reinforcement. Then we get into the issues where if I always have to negatively reinforce it, I'm like, this is what I call I use this with my clients often, because they think like, okay, once the dog is trained, I don't have to feed it anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, sure, you can try that, but then your cues, that's why I said, I believe your cues, your commands are also markers, right?
I think I get where you're going with that. Yeah.
Right. So I call it the Pavlovian bank account.
Yeah.
If you are going to tell your dog sit and it doesn't want to, because now you're working in higher distraction environments, but you have an e-collar, you have a prong collar, whatever, and now you're negatively reinforcing the sit, then you're subtracting money from the bank account, right?
Yeah.
And you can also add it back in if you're rewarding it positively with food, let's say, or with a toy, right? So you're always playing in this sort of spectrum here, in my opinion.
Yeah.
For me, it's once a cue is conditioned and you have the availability of negatively reinforcing it, you enter this loop.
Yeah. So
right.
To make sure I understand you correctly, because I think I get where you're going with this. So what you're saying is the command, right? Once the command is taught or the cue is taught, the dog will then, depending on the history of reinforcement, the dog will always have this spectrum of association with the cue of either being really positive, really negative, or somewhere in the middle, fairly neutral. And then basically your use of negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement in order to reinforce said command will always be impacting that forever, which is why you say that the cue in and of itself is a marker that will predict either the positive, the negative, or the neutral, that wherever you're at in the Pavlovian bank account analogy with that cue.
Correct.
Okay. I like that. Yeah.
Fair enough. I thought about it because like some people, like I said, there's people who they'll go through training and they're like, well, yeah, the dog should know it.
Sure.
And I'm like, well, yeah, but are you keeping track? Like, do you have a notebook where you have explicitly looked at like, okay, I did 7,000 reps at the park.
Yeah.
In total,
Isn't that kind of it, where it's like, people, like, I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but like people say like, when does training end? It's like an interesting conversation. And it's like, you'll never be finished generalizing and proofing in every circumstance ever. It just doesn't, it will never happen. You know what I mean?
No.
So you will always be contingent on forever adding some degree of reinforcement in, which is why one of my big shticks or sayings that I tell clients all the time is behavior is always contingent on consistent reinforcement, right? I've always said that, basically meaning if at any point in the lifespan of the dog, the reinforcement for either doing something or not doing something just disappears forever, there's no amount of training you'll do that will make the dog still perform forever under those circumstances, right?
Yep, exactly. Because at the end of the day, we get back to prediction error. If I now stop reinforcing it altogether, then it's negative prediction error, right? The thing they were expecting to happen didn't happen.
Yeah.
And so now they have no incentive to even try to do it. Yeah. Like, then the behavior just becomes extinguished, basically, over time.
Yeah, this is super interesting, and we could talk on this freaking alone forever, but I'm going to shut up and let you continue now.
but you've noticed this, like, When a dog has been positively reinforced for something in the past, and now it isn't anymore, but now it's going to get negatively reinforced for something, you see that the motivation gets depleted. You see that the behavior is slower.
Yeah. Well, I see it in both directions, right? So, like, let's say I'm working with a dog where I've trained, we'll use a bed stay as an example again, a bed stay with positive reinforcement for 3 or 4 weeks, right? And the dog is really sound with it. And then the very first time they don't do it and I implement negative reinforcement, you could see that immediate dip in drive after. You know what I mean?
100%.
So then you have to go through the process.
The dopamine is not firing anymore, right? It's going the opposite way.
100%. Or on the contrary, right? Like if you've trained it with negative reinforcement exclusively, right? And the dog's doing it. And then, you start either, and this is why I added the neutral into it. Obviously, you're using the positive or the negative as far as your bank account analogy. The reason why I'm using a spectrum instead in my mind is because I feel like the prediction error of also, if I'm using negative reinforcement, not the dog learning how to avoid that pressure, I feel like also starts to move the needle in the direction of being more neutral. It might not get you to positive, like you said, but it will get you eventually to a point of more neutral with things.
So let's do this. I'll give you a quick, this is something we'll talk about later.
Okay.
So just so we can keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. And since we're talking about negative reinforcement, zoom in here. So here's the citation for the study if anyone wants to go look it up. But there was an experiment with rats done in 2019 where they figured out that the dopamine spike, once the organism, in this case the rats, had understood how to successfully avoid in this case it was a foot shock, meaning they had a platform, the rats would run through a maze and there was a portion of the platform or of the maze that was electrified, right? And if I'm not mistaken, they were taught to press a lever that would then activate a cue, a sound that would make them understand that they were in a safety zone, so to speak.
Got it.
So whenever that sound came on, the rats understood, okay, I'm safe.
Oh, is this the safety training? Was this the safety training study? Are you familiar with that? I heard it. I remember I was at Tyler Muto's place one time, and he was talking about safety training, which was like a study that Tritronics did back in the day, where basically it was the same deal. They were teaching a signal that predicted the release of pressure, right? So it was like a negative reinforcement marker, if you will, right? And then
the release of pressure.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is interesting because like historically you think like the pressure releases, why do you need a signal for it? But basically the fact they conditioned in a tone right prior to release of pressure. I think it was either prior to or right after. I don't remember exactly which one. But then they utilized that marker. I'll have to do an entire podcast on this where I pull it up because I'm going to totally butcher this right now. But anyways, in a nutshell, they utilized this study to show that conditioned in marker then used in their training plan basically, presented like it was like an 85 to 90% decrease in aggression, like borderline forever with the individual dogs that they were working with.
What was this? Was this aggression? You mean redirection onto the handler or something?
I think it was just like it was. They were studying various types of aggression with it, right? So dogs being aggressive towards other dogs or towards people. So I'll have to look into it if you're not.
That'd be cool. Yeah, if you find it, send it to me. I don't think I know that study. Yeah, that's cool. Well, anyway, in this study, they found out that when the animals understand how to successfully avoid it, the cue, right, is like literally the same dopamine spike for the cue that anticipates positive reinforcement and achieving the reward is pretty much identical to this. It's the same structure. Right. So we're finding out now, and I think what's her name, Melanie, Dr. Melanie Oide. I can't. She talked about this recently, and I found it really interesting that negative reinforcement, just like positive reinforcement, if taught correctly, right, where the dog in this case understands that it can shut it off properly, creates the same dynamic we see in positive reinforcement in terms of dopamine is created also in negative reinforcement. So I thought that was pretty cool. I thought that was really cool because
without the use of additional positive reinforcement, you're saying, right?
Exactly. And that's what she said later. It was like, well, in the real training world, right, because this is a study on rats in a lab, it's a sterile environment, but in the real world, we stack these. Right? So imagine if the cue for negative reinforcement also predicts positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
Which sort of tying back into the whole, remind me his name, the Nepo Po guy?
Curable.
Yeah.
Kiba.
That the whole Nepo Po thing, because I've been listening to it for a while. I've been listening to Bart Bellin talk and stuff like this. I was like,
yeah,
these guys are like miles ahead of me in terms of like ability and their competence as dog trainers. Like they've been around for a long time. If Pat Stewart's talking about this and Bart Bellin and so forth, they must be onto something, right? That's what started to get me thinking of all this sort of stuff. And it's like, well, if, like you said, if the negative reinforcement cue is what's getting them active, this might be some way to explain that.
Okay,
to
so
start explaining it anyway.
So last podcast, we talked near the end of it about the idea of intrinsically and extrinsically motivated animals, right? And we talked about this concept that, you know, once you start getting paid for the thing you like to do, it becomes less fun. And then we kind of use the example I think I brought up where, like, isn't that like overshadowing, right, to some extent, right? And whatever, we won't get super far into that. But wouldn't this just be that same example? Because wouldn't and I don't know if you know this or not, wouldn't the successful avoidance feeling be an intrinsic feeling, right?
Correct.
Where the positive reinforcement would be an extrinsic reinforcement then or an extrinsic motivator at that point. So wouldn't that just be the same thing? And wouldn't we say that, like, you can't really stack them together because, like, they're only going to be motivated by one or the other more, and it will overshadow the other one?
Correct. And you're not wrong. But I have a secondary part to this,
all right,
which is my workaround. So I made this whole diagram. We can zoom out real quick for everyone to look at it real quick. It's a bit of a, it's pretty,
this is,
it's pretty
I've
intense.
never made anything like this in my life, and I never will, just so everybody knows.
It's just because this is how my brain sort of works. I
like
think
it.
I sent you an
love
email.
It. Yeah. I love
It's just kind of how my brain works. Is I'm like, look, I think I wrote you in the email last time. It's like, I think sort of like in dimensions sometimes, and it's hard for me to sort of congruently put everything together sometimes. So I make a lot of stuff like this all the time to sort of make sense of stuff. To get back on track. When I started hearing about the whole activation thing, I was like, well, scientifically, if there were a way, if this were a thing that actually works, how would it work? Right? So for me, when you say, well, if we just stack positive reinforcement on top of intrinsically rewarding, shutting off negative reinforcement, then isn't there overshadowing? And this is my workaround for that. So there's a weird intersection between negative punishment and positive reinforcement. Right here, that's the intersection I'm talking about. Think of an out command, right? Trained the Ivan Balabanov way. Let's say, whereby the quicker you release the toy,
quicker game starts,
the faster it's going to come back to you. Right? That's autonomy from the dog's end because it's actively giving up something. It's engaging in negative punishment on its own behalf because it's intrinsically motivated to receive it back. Right? So, there's brief definitions and stuff of what actually is going on here. So, expectation. If the expectation for PR isn't met, the organism experiences shift down the spectrum towards negative punishment. Right? So, if the dog is expecting a reward and it doesn't achieve it, it goes back down to negative punishment. Right? Cortisol, dopamine. Concomitantly, as the spectrum moves towards negative punishment, more cortisol is released in the organism. Oppositely, upward motion towards PR increases dopamine. Right? So cortisol is a stress hormone, and dopamine is a feel-good hormone, in very basic terms. Back to competence. As an organism gains more competence in producing and acquiring the reward, NP fades in significance, and the organism stabilizes towards the center of the spectrum unless criteria are changed, which would reactivate the whole cycle. Right? Which is why, and I've heard Michael Ellis talk about this before, at the very beginning stages of something, you can negatively punish a dog, and they will understand really quickly, hey, that's not going to get me the reward. Right? But once the dog is really proficient in doing XYZ behavior, and now you try to negatively punish it, it doesn't necessarily care anymore. Right? But it's at this interesting sort of middle point that we get this. So there's no numerical value to this. I did that on purpose. I just want to show, and you probably, like being a musician, you know about sine waves probably. If there's opposite sine waves, they cancel out, right? So in this case, frustration, punishment, I put them as equal. So the higher the expectation, which is the green, the higher the dopamine. And at this point, if we were to take the positive reinforcement away, or the expectation, we fall into punishment. And therefore also frustration rises. Competence also rises, and the higher the competence in the dog to achieve that reward, the less we see this playing an effect. Right? So it cancels out. Which brings me to the next thing we were talking about with the out.
Is that, can I stop you for a second there and say, like, so that's why, let's say you're training a sit with positive reinforcement, it is very imperative that the second the dog sits, you positively reinforce them, because if they're not competent in the behavior yet, the longer of a delay, the longer it falls into punishment, right?
Correct.
Which is why you see owners, and we have to constantly tell people, like, some people are really slow on reward delivery when they're training things initially, and you could actually hurt yourself more than help yourself. But then once the dog is competent in it, like we hear, you know, you train duration by delaying the reward. But you can delay the reward without it being punishment because the dog is competent in the behavior then, right?
Correct. Or the perceived punishment for that matter.
Sure.
Because as the dog gains competence, it understands the longer I stay here, the more I stabilize in this position, whether it be a sit or down or whatever, the more I am creating that curve to achieve the thing I want.
Yep. Makes sense.
Right? So going back to the whole concept of operance, there's a point where the dog, in this case, understands that it can affect the outcomes by its action. It's not just like waiting there to see if you're going to give it the treat or not. It now has a concrete way of understanding what it has to do to achieve that.
Makes sense.
Right? And so if you layer all that in a way where you mitigate all the frustration and the punishment, like I was saying earlier, when the dog is asked to out, momentarily relinquishing access to a primary reinforcer, for example, toy, entering a transient negative punishment state because it has to give it up, right? We could argue that the giving up is the negative punishment. However, if conditioned through repetition and cue predictability, the release cue becomes a classically conditioned signal for future opportunity for PR, for positive reinforcement. Rather than eliciting frustration or loss, this is a cue that engages the dog in a proactive operant cycle, transforming NP, or negative punishment, into a drive-inducing marker for anticipated reward.
So is what you're go ahead. Never mind. Sorry, go ahead.
Just wanted to finish that one real quick. In this scenario, motivation is no longer reactive, but strategically anticipatory, exemplifying the emergence of autonomous operants altogether.
So is what you're kind of what you're getting at here, if I'm not mistaken, is, okay, so the out, right? The out, they're releasing something which, you know, for all things considered, it should be kind of like a punishing feeling to them, right? They're not getting the reward anymore. We're withholding it from them. But through repetition of them being in that state of aversion, if you will, then leading to further, opportunities for reinforcement, that state of aversion should become a positive, if you will. Is that kind of where you're going with this? And then you could then tie that into negative reinforcement. You could do the same thing with?
The negative reinforcement one is slightly different, but the processes are roughly the same. So back to this graph here. That's why it cancels out, right? The frustration and the punishment effects cancel out the more the dog, in this case, understands that it can out to receive.
Of course. Yeah, no, I understand that. So did I, forget the negative reinforcement example then, did I understand this example correctly then, what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
And what I'm getting to, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is my whole thing with the activation though, like, doesn't that just mean you've, through the future opportunity of positive reinforcement, counter conditioned that aversive response to releasing a toy?
Yes and no.
Right? Because that's my whole thing with it, right? Is like, I could understand, like, what you're saying makes total sense to me, right? And it's obviously not wrong, but I think the key here is still saying that releasing the toy in that moment is still an aversive sensation to the dog. But once you've hit that point you're describing, I feel like it's not then, right? It's just, they're just releasing the toy because something, better is going to happen later on, but that doesn't mean releasing the toy is aversive to them in that moment, does it?
Not once it's been trained.
Yeah.
For one. And two, let's look, it's a similar dichotomy, right?
Yep.
Dogs that like to chase squirrels, they like to do it because of the I might catch it.
Sure.
Right? What really exacerbates that behavior is the fact that they might catch it. It's not if they catch it.
Yeah.
Or when they catch. It's like this is an opportunity to maybe get closer to catching.
Yeah.
Right? What ends up happening when they don't is they just try harder. Right? So even though negative punishment is involved there, it's not perceived as punishment.
Sure.
It's perceived as motivation.
Correct.
Because next time I have to try harder.
Yeah. That makes sense to me.
Right?
I mean, that makes complete, and this is what we talked about last time. I think our biggest key point we talked about is like, what are dogs inherently motivated by, right? And getting out of this framework of like, oh, they didn't catch it, so that should be punishing to them. But, in their mind, they're not perceiving it that way, right? Or,
exactly.
We use the example of different types of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement and this and that, right? But still, so I'm curious where you go with this, but yeah.
Yeah. So to answer your question, it's like, well, have you, what was it? Have you counter-conditioned their response because something positive will happen?
Yeah.
Well, yes and no again, because we're tapping into this mindset here, whereby like there's some Pavlovian studies where if something has been extremely reinforced, whether it be intrinsically motivating or extrinsically motivating, it's durable under positive punishment for
sure. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
This you can see like what's his name? I have him here in my notes. Fiorillo in 2003. He did some studies on gambling, right?
Yeah.
So dopamine fires most at the uncertain anticipatory phase, when it's like roughly 50% reward probability, which, tying back to the whole chasing the squirrel thing, maybe not.
Yep.
Right? So that's how you create ridiculous drive. Yeah. It's not just how to explain it? One thing would just be, okay, positive reinforcement and done. And the other thing is positive reinforcement with maybe you will get the positive reinforcement.
Yeah, but that doesn't make... I get where you're going with this. So like, the punishing effects plus the reinforcing effects together like create this ridiculous drive. But that doesn't make the punishing effects less aversive, right? Like, and that also it doesn't make them positive. I don't know. I'm trying to use the example of gambling. Like I was in Vegas last year and I lost a decent amount of money, right? Like, and like I'm just trying to think, like, when I hit my losses, I felt like fucking like it was I didn't feel good, right? Like,
right.
But
you're not a compulsive gambler, right?
No, I'm not no. This was like a one-time thing, just so everybody knows. Yeah, like, and it wasn't. Right, it actually wasn't that much money, but like, nonetheless, right?
That's my point, though. Like, if someone who is a compulsive gambler, if they had that loss, they wouldn't care. It's not aversive to them anymore. They just go try harder again.
But I don't know, right? Like, I guess we would have to talk to a compulsive gambler, but I would argue they still feel like absolute fucking trash when they hit that loss. But the future possibility of getting reinforced by it still is so strong that punishment in that moment isn't strong enough to prevent it.
Exactly.
Right? But that doesn't mean that the punishment is driving it, though, right?
No, it doesn't mean the punishment is driving it, but it does mean that the intersection between the punishment and the motivation of receiving it is what's driving it.
Say that again.
It doesn't mean that the punishment is what's driving it necessarily, or alone, so to speak. It's the intersection between the two. It
makes you want to access the reinforcement more. I mean, it makes you want to like recoup the loss so that you feel better, right? It makes you want to seek out positive reinforcement a little bit more.
But especially if you have the skills
isn't it the contrast is what makes the potential positive reinforcement more reinforcing? Is that kind of where you're getting with this?
In certain ways, yes. Yeah, exactly. In certain ways, yes. And also, I'm tapping into it's not only the consequence, it's the state inside these two when you're living here. Mm-hmm. If you remember when we finished last podcast, I told you I have like a bit of a weird visualization of how the quadrants work.
Yes.
Right. So we're starting to get into that already. I think here, and I don't necessarily want to call it a quadrant per se, but I think this here in itself is a driving motivator aside from these two.
And what is, explain that middle ground again one more time?
So this middle ground is when you're conscious that there is repercussions for not getting the thing, but there is also the probability that you might.
Sure.
And if we train your winner effect, so to speak, whereby we've always given you, and now we start doing 50-50, and then we do random, which is what we do in dog training, right? The reinforcement schedules, that is. Mm-hmm. Now, if we also add chasing, like prey drive into it, then we are living here, where it's like an exacerbated state of drive. And not only are you're not at the whim of it anymore, of maybe receiving it, maybe not, you are actively engaging in I can, and therefore I might. Which ties back to the autonomy competence thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So once you're competent, you could basically, or once you feel competent, you could still seek to access positive reinforcement, even with the face of potential consequences.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Correct.
So tie this into, though, I get this, right? This makes sense to me, but I'm still having a hard time connecting this to like when people say activation, right? Like how this is that, right?
Yeah. For me, this was the missing piece, because it's not just negative reinforcement plus positive reinforcement equals activation. Mm-hmm. There has to be something that intrinsically drives past the extrinsic motivation of just receiving food or toy.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, but here's I get where you're going with this, I think. But like when I look at this graph here, you got the negative punishment and the positive reinforcement. The reason why this works is because under most circumstances, it's going to be the same motivator, if you will, that's creating both of those things, right? So the squirrel is both the positive reinforcement as well as the negative punishment, right? But when you start getting into then positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, the positive reinforcement is not, the motivator is not also the negative reinforcement. They're two different things still, right?
Correct. Which is why I still argue that this is the missing piece, because how do you expect negative reinforcement? How do you expect, like if I have kibble, right? And it's just kibble, how do you expect that a dog will have that, what they're calling this sort of like active fighting state, right? For something like kibble, just kibble alone, right? You have to have undergone this process here first to find kibble insane before we can even think about activating the dog.
Do you though? I mean, like what you're saying is for a dog to be very motivated by kibble, they have to have experienced it being withheld. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily withheld, but for example, I had a client the other day. I told her, just give the dog food. And I forgot to explain to her, no, it's not just giving food. It's moving with giving food. Because the dog, the first time it went, she just stayed stationary.
Sure.
Didn't really care about the food. Mm-hmm. But the second she started moving, the dog was like, oh.
Yeah, it gets more exciting. Cool. That's like the motivation games that Michael Ellis did, the power training games with food and all that.
So when I'm creating ball drive, for example, I hold my dog back. I'm like, no, you're not going to get it yet. I tease them, etc. And they almost get it. And then they almost get it. And then they get it.
Yeah.
And I do this over and over and over again. And I make it harder and harder and harder. And then at some point I add obedience into it as well, or I do the out thing. They're like, oh, if I work harder, I get it.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why I said this was the missing piece for me. It's the fact that the competence, autonomy, and the competence and the autonomy within the dog to understand, oh, I can actually produce an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I can fail. I don't want to fail. So I try harder.
Yeah.
Right? That's the missing piece for me that I think wasn't being talked about.
So what are you arguing that the activation is then?
So we can, if you want, we can just skip. The rest of the stuff here is pretty basic. We've talked about this before. You understand that positive punishment and negative reinforcement both have an escape and avoiding an aversive sensation are present in both.
Yes.
Right? We talked about this last time, whether if a dog is jumping up on a counter and you positive punish, if you nick it at a high level versus if you add negative reinforcement, isn't the nicking at a high level also just negative reinforcement at some point, right?
Yeah.
I hope I explained that clearly.
Yes.
And I just sort of made some graphs about that too, where, again, the more agency, the more competence, the further the organism moves away from stress and learned helplessness into what becomes control over the outcome, right?
Yeah, which is kind of exactly what we were talking about that temporary phase in training with negative reinforcement there.
Correct. And that training phase might be somewhere here.
Yes, sure. Yep.
Right? Mm-hmm. And then you're slowly moving and then boop, and then it cancels out.
Exactly. Yes, I got it.
Right?
Yep.
I wanted to just briefly explain that, like, negative reinforcement and positive punishment, positive reinforcement, positive punishment and positive reinforcement, to get, like, they also have this intermediary point and they have the same structure as this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as an organism gains cognizance that it can affect its outcome positively by avoiding an aversive, it not only gains autonomy over the outcome, but learns to predict and situate itself to its advantage, especially when PR is a potential outcome for successfully navigating through the structure.
Yep. Okay, so
that's pretty basic.
Slight quick sidebar conversation just pertaining to that. So how do you define the difference between positive punishment and negative reinforcement as far as the application of it? Because this is kind of like, I feel like what you just described here, like, is it once the dog has learned to successfully avoid negative reinforcement, it starts turning into positive punishment for them in that moment, using your graph here of the positive punishment and positive reinforcement intersection? Because, like, wouldn't many people argue so many people would argue that you can't implement positive punishment for a command. You are only ever using negative reinforcement for it because the pressure will only ever stop once the dog gets into position, right? Mm-hmm. But what your graph is showing here is the positive punishment, right, with the positive reinforcement and the competency point that you have in it, right, is, what is, I'm assuming that competency point is like take a command, right? Once a command has been positively reinforced or positively punished enough to create the competency, you get that point right there. Do you get what I'm saying?
Right. So what was the guy's name? Ivan's student?
Dylan.
There you go. Dylan. He talked about a dog that he was working on where basically he just to cut it really short, he sort of punished the dog for all the stuff it was doing incorrectly, right?
Sure.
Until the point where the dog said, well, I have no more options. Mm-hmm. Now let me just chill.
Sure.
Right? And then that's what I'm talking about here. Mm-hmm. Right? It's when you, in terms of positive punishment, there's cues, there's different things that happen during the punishment that the dog understands, okay, I just don't do that thing anymore. I'm in avoidance successfully with competence.
Yeah.
And now I'm neutral. Mm-hmm. Right? So we talked about this last time. If you have a dog chasing a cat, would you rather recall it or just use your punishment mark?
Yeah.
Right? That's this. That's all this is.
Got it. So you're not even talking about doing something specifically, right? You're talking about, like, in this case, since you have positive punishment on there, you are just trying to prevent something in that moment.
For example, or I gave the example last time as well. When you and I differ on this. You will say no, which is your punishment marker, and unavoidably after no, punishment occurs. Yes. Right? Always. Yep. You said last time, always. Every time I say no, high stim.
Yeah. We could have a separate conversation about some slight caveats I have to that, but we'll save that for another time.
Okay, fair enough.
Because there are some circumstances in which I will not actually give punishment after the marker. Okay. Very, very few circumstances, but that's a separate conversation we'll have. Got you.
I wanted to experiment with, well, if the punishment marker is conditioned,
yes,
right, and we talked about this last time, then the avoidance should just come naturally anyway, because it's a conditioned cue that something's going to happen, right?
Sure.
And so I'm testing whether my dog has the autonomy and the competence to shut that off.
Yep.
Right? And that's where positive punishment, negative reinforcement sort of blend together, because at that point when I'm saying no, turning back around from chasing the cat is negative reinforcement. Mm-hmm. Right? So my cue, no, is both things technically.
Yeah.
But it's still
you're saying turning back around is negatively reinforcing, like you're negatively reinforcing turning back around also, right?
Yeah,
for sure.
Exactly. So that there is this sort of cross section there, but we're still talking about the same thing, whereby competence equals like the competence in positive punishment and negative reinforcement is the fact that they can avoid it.
Yeah.
That they know what to do.
So is it so, and this is again I separate conversations kind of, but like the positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement spectrum has been a really interesting one to me lately, because as I've been like talking it out loud on different episodes and hearing other people talk about it, it is interesting where it's like, how do you just do positive punishment without negative reinforcement, or does that even exist? You know?
Maybe not.
Isn't that interesting? Because it's like I've always looked at it as it comes from the applicator's state of mind of like pressure will still release at some point, obviously, but like it will never consistently release in one spot, because the only thing we care about is not doing one particular thing, right? So that to me would be I'm applying positive punishment in that moment, right? But if I were trying to seek a specific thing for the dog to do, obviously the pressure would release in one spot and it would become negative reinforcement. But I guess what I'm getting at is the dog ever aware of the difference between the two? Or does that come from the competency? Once they hit competency of either doing the thing or avoiding the thing, the dog determines that it's either positive punishment or negative reinforcement.
I'd argue the dog is showing you the whole time what it thinks is going on. So when you apply positive punishment, you see complete shutdown and no attempt to reinstate that behavior that was just previously punished.
Yep.
When applied correctly, obviously. On the negative reinforcement scale, you can continue to apply negative reinforcement to a behavior and it might creep up again.
Yeah.
And you just have to apply negative reinforcement until the dog understands it, right? That's how I would say the dog is showing us the whole time what it thinks of the aversive stimuli and its level applied to it.
But
it's showing it through its body.
But is there necessarily a difference between what you are physically doing as the handler in that moment, or it only becomes positive positive punishment or negative punishment once the dog shows you one or the other?
Ooh, elaborate on that, please.
So kind of what I just described, right? Let's use your cat chasing example, right? And, dog chases the cat and we punish them for it, right? We give a big correction for it. And the dog just instinctually turns around and runs back to us, right? Though we are implementing positive punishment in that moment for chasing the cat. But in the dog's mind temporarily, they may think it was negative reinforcement for coming back to us, right? So through repetition, then the next time the dog goes to chase the cat, they get punishment again for it. And this time, maybe instead of turning and running back to us, maybe they turn and look at us instead, right? And then the dog starts shifting the state of mind of like, okay, I thought before that it was I needed to go all the way back to them, but this time the pressure stopped when I just turned and looked at them. And then the next time they chase the cat, they get punished for it, and they just stop chasing the cat and then go lay on their dog bed. And at a certain point, after a couple of applications of positive punishment, the dog will realize it's not negative reinforcement to do a specific thing. It's just positive punishment to not do a specific thing. Does that make sense?
Fair enough. And I think they do live on a spectrum, and I think they both can be together in some way.
What I'm just getting at is like, is there a difference in the application though? Because like, I feel like, again, watching some of these guys, like Dylan's another one who's done it. There's a lot I like about him, but like, I do think there are some circumstances he gets a little too, the TWC course knows everything. So like, it does no wrongs and like whatever. And I hear him talk a lot about like, oh yeah, well, you think you're punishing things, but you're just negatively reinforcing things. And if you took the TWC course, you would know the difference of when I apply punishment, but they never really explain the difference, if you will. Right. So that's where I'm kind of like getting at, like, I'm trying to read between the lines and see, is there a difference in application of negative reinforcement or positive punishment that me or many other dog trainers are just missing? Or is it really what I just described, which is just through use of positive reinforcement or positive punishment or negative punishment, the dog figures out that it's one or the other?
Right. I'm very open-minded with everything like this type of discussion. So I will give you the favor in the sense, and I'll say, yeah, it can happen. Yeah, maybe. Sure. Right. I'm not against saying, well, that's an interesting theory. Might be true.
There might be more. That's what I'm saying. There definitely might be more to it. That's kind of what I'm just trying to like read between the lines and figure out, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, in a sort of classical understanding way, if the intensity of the negative reinforcement supersedes, right, the motivation. That's why I created this.
Sure.
If we go all the way here, then we probably punished, right?
Well, maybe, because and I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but like, is the intensity the deciding factor, or is the dog, because it could still, a very intense level of aversion can still be negative reinforcement.
Depends.
What circumstance wouldn't it be, would you say?
So,
like, if I'm trying to negatively reinforce a bed and I take something insanely fucking aversive, right? And, it's ridiculously aversive, but the dog still learns that they can escape it by getting onto the bed, it's still negative reinforcement, no matter what degree of aversion I apply, as long as they figure out they can escape it at that point, right?
But isn't that just the same as saying dog is scared of fireworks, fireworks are aversive, dog hides under table?
Negative reinforcement, right? They learn.
Is that negative reinforcement? Or
well, technically, because they're not escaping it. They're hiding under the table, obviously, but the fireworks are not going away, right?
Mm-hmm. But it's still aversive enough that the dog doesn't want it, and it's trying to find a way to shut it off.
Yeah, but the difference is like they physically can't escape them. You know what I mean? Like they never disappear. Right? I mean, they do at a certain point, obviously, but like the dog is gonna try all sorts of different things and then eventually just completely shut down because it is it's learned that is an example of then just learned helplessness. Right? There's nothing.
It's not going away.
Yeah, there's nothing they could do to escape it. So I would say that's not really punishment or negative reinforcement. Right? Is question for you? Right? Is learned helplessness one or the other, or is it a separate thing?
I think learned helplessness is the inability to meet criteria.
Okay.
Under aversive control.
Sure.
That isn't clear.
Yeah. So would that would not be negative reinforcement, and that would not be positive punishment then at that point?
No.
Okay. No. Yeah. Okay. So we agree on that.
But it's the same. Like I think learned helplessness falls into all four of these actually. Like if the criteria just isn't clear.
Sure.
Then I'm just gonna offer.
Yeah.
The next behavior. And if that's still not clear, then I'm going to offer. And at some point, it depends on the personality of the dog.
Yeah.
To the point where they give up. If you have a weak dog, they'll give up quicker. If you have a stronger dog, they might not.
So we could put the box of learned helplessness like right in the middle of all of these and say that like, because I would still guess or assume that it would be like the improper use of all of these would lead to learned helplessness, right?
Sure. It's not. Yeah. Sure. Fair enough. Let's say that, and let's say even more. It's not only the improper use of all of these. It's just improper use of everything altogether.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Just your general approach to the dog is inappropriate.
I gotcha. Yeah. For sure.
You're being unclear. You're not showing the dog what to do.
Yes.
The dog is trying, and you still shut it down for trying.
Yep.
There's no intrinsic, no extrinsic, nothing. It doesn't understand how to do anything, and it just says, "Okay, I'm done."
Yeah. I gotcha.
Right.
Okay. Proceed.
But you made me think now. It's like, fair enough. Like, I'm still of the belief that if you add something sufficiently intense, to where you might even just need one time, but it's so intense that I say, you know what, never going to do that again.
Sure.
right? And that depends on the organism you have in front of you.
Yeah. So let's use the example of fireworks, because that would be something you would probably argue is something of that level of intensity for some dogs, right? So what if the situation happened though, where that firework happened? You have a dog that's absolutely fucking petrified of fireworks to the moon and back. Firework blows off, they go run hide under the bed, and then no more fireworks happen, and that situation repeats itself multiple times. Don't you think the dog would start becoming confident in the fact that they could avoid fireworks by just going under the bed and no longer be like petrified? Right?
Fair enough. And then I have a question for you. Isn't that also a superstitious association?
I don't know. Elaborate on why it would be.
So if just per happenstance, firework goes off, terrified, run under bed, fireworks don't happen again.
Yeah.
Then isn't that just associative learning happening? It just happened to be that
elaborate a
way.
little more, maybe. So I guess I'm not following. Like, are you saying that being out in the house, there would be a superstitious association of when I'm out here, fireworks may happen eventually?
No, let me explain it better. And this is why I say autonomy and competence are so important.
Yeah.
To help get rid of the fallout, right?
Yeah.
So if your dog is super well trained on bed, right, and something bad happens, XYZ, whatever, but they find it aversive enough, and in their learning history, they've understood, okay, I can just go to the bed and it shuts off.
Yeah.
Then they might apply that to everything else as well, right?
Yeah. So are you saying dog is super competent in getting on bed, then suddenly one day when they're on the bed, firework goes off while they're on bed, and then they develop a superstitious association with the bed, even though they were very competent in it?
Opposite. That they're somewhere in the house, fireworks go off, and they say safe place is bed.
Yeah, sure.
Right? But it just happened to be that way. That's what I'm trying to argue. It's like it just happened
happened to go to the bed, and then the fireworks stopped.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying. So that would still just be accidental, but negative reinforcement of the bed even further, right?
In this case, yes.
Where I'm missing you is the superstitious association part, right?
Just the fact that it happened like as per happenstance.
Yeah.
And then they thought, well, okay, because this happened and it ended when I got there. That's the resolution.
Sure.
Because that's all that superstitious associations are. Really, it's like, like with reactivity, I don't like that dog coming up to me. Let me show some intensity. Let me show more intensity. Let me show more intensity. And per happenstance, because like we're walking past each other with two separate dogs, I'm not going to stay there.
Of course.
So that your dog can just freak out. I'm leaving.
Dog goes away, reinforces
right?
It, right?
And so then the dog, superstitious association, says my barking created that.
Yeah. Okay. I've just never heard that described as a superstitious association, I guess.
I think of it that way because in some ways there's nothing else to show the dog that is what is in the head of the dog. That is what it's thinking is happening.
Yes,
right?
I get where
it's the same when a dog gets corrected with an e-collar next to a pole.
Yeah, sure.
For the first time ever, and they're like, that pole is bad news. I'm not going to be there.
Yes. Yeah. So okay, I get where you're going with this, and this is where I got back to my initial question about like, is it the application of negative reinforcement or positive punishment, or is it then the repetition of experiencing it and learning how to escape or avoid it, which then dictates it as positive punishment or negative punishment? Because yes, I agree completely that like, you could train a bed stay using negative reinforcement, because we keep using that example, and the very first time you ever engage negative reinforcement and get the dog onto the bed and turn it off, they may temporarily think, I don't know, something superstitious about the crate that you're next to or whatever being the thing that kind of bit them. But after a handful of repetitions of it, they will become confident that it's not the crate didn't bite them. It's not positive punishment for that. It is, in fact, negative reinforcement because it shuts off every time I get in this spot.
To some extent, yes. And depending on how the dog is perceiving it, you can have problems or not. Yeah. If the response is fear, then you have to counter condition it there and in another place and another place and another place. Mm-hmm. With fear, it's a bit tricky. So like I think we talked about this last time as well. If you have someone with PTSD, you can train them to, let's say in this case with gunshots, for example, right? You can train them in the therapy room to be okay with gunshots, but if they leave the therapy room and there's gunshots on the street, they're freaking the fuck out.
Sure.
Right? So if that is what happens with your dog, then fair enough, you can resolve it in your house. In this case, it's fine because you're not going to be using the crate, let's say, somewhere else. But if you have to travel with the crate, then you have to recondition it in the car, in the new house you're going to, on the street, wherever you're going to be using the crate. So then you stack problems onto itself.
Yeah.
That's just a clarification. It's not a counterpoint or anything. It's just
I get what you're saying.
Something to think about.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, obviously it takes a certain amount of repetitions and generalization, obviously, in order for the dog to become confident in the negative reinforcement as exclusively negative reinforcement, right? Kind of, if you will.
Are we good on that, or
no,
we?
I think we're good on that. Yeah.
That's a heavy one. The positive punishment one and the negative reinforcement one still one that I'll have to sort of dive deeper into, huh?
Yeah.
But in my sort of view, basically agency-driven outcomes, internally motivated within the organism, cognition of consequences present, decision-making becomes proactive, not reactive. Whether it's positive punishment, negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement, or negative punishment. Once the dog gains operance, it's now in control of what will happen in the future. So the organism isn't merely at the whim of post-behavior consequences like Skinner argued. It becomes the one driving the behavior forward, proactively navigating towards a better outcome. Mm-hmm. Right? So to tie in sort of with the Nepo post stuff, they always argue that the dog is seeking out its advantage. Heard this from what's his name? Justin Rigney, right? Justin Rigney talked a lot about this before he left the Nepo Po camp.
That's like one of their big things is dogs do things to better their situation. I know Kiba said that a bunch of times on the podcast. Yeah. That's a big one they have. And I mean, I think it's correct. At the end of the day, if we think about motivational states, they're just trying to find the best solution to move forward with. Yes.
Right? So now we get back into this sort of stuff. This is how I view. So most people, where we started, most people view cues in this regard, in this fashion right here. Mm-hmm. I view it this way. So like I say, it's difficult to visualize, but imagine each quadrant as a spectrum populated by countless cues, both classical and operant. So everywhere here, all along the board, there's little dots that can be their own individual cue, right? And so whether they're instrumental cues or predictive cues, classical conditioning cues are constantly forming across this continuum, often in response to the organism's internal prediction error signals, right?
Yeah. And this is what you're suggesting with the bank analogy is like, depending on with every cue, like obviously a traditional marker, right, is going to be as pushed in one direction of it as possible as it can get, right? But your other cues are going to be a bit more on a spectrum that you use.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, I understand that.
I think
that makes sense.
And I think they're always shifting, right?
Yeah.
They're always shifting depending on what you're doing and how the learning is taking place.
Uh-huh.
So, like, going back to Michael Ellis, he says there's a video of him on Learbird talking about when he starts integrating no with puppies.
Yes.
So
the crate and stuff.
Puppy's in the crate. Puppy wants to go out the crate before it's released, before it's given its release cue. He says nope and shuts the door. Negative punishment, right? But then no can easily shift here eventually in the training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so this makes complete sense to me because again, I don't want to talk too much about my use of the no marker and punishment markers and stuff. But one of I said there's a couple caveats to where I will not provide a punishment after. And it's if I feel like the dog's averse reaction to the punishment marker is like, I don't even want to say too intense, but like when I'm doing basic obedience training, right? It's like, it's too strongly conditioned in that moment. I might go a couple of days of just using the no independently and bring it down a few notches, right? Bring the intensity down a few notches, or in your case, like bring it into a different end of the spectrum to kind of balance things out a bit, right? And it's something I kind of play around with a little bit. But yeah, that's one of the places I will where
most trainers will have this though.
Yes, yeah, negative punishment marker. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And which I think we talked about last time as well. A cue still is a cue if it's no versus no. that's two different cues for the dog.
Sure.
Right? Even though for us it's the same word, you can still have no and no.
Yeah, yeah. So you're saying the inflection of the cue, obviously it's technically different, even though it's the same word, it sounds different. It's a different stimuli.
At the end of the day, it's just sounds for our dogs.
Yeah, okay. That's an interesting point to that, because a lot of people talk about the intensity of how I give the command. When I say sit, the dog sits. But when I say sit, they don't sit. And a lot of people think it's because of the harshness of it, but it's because, that cue in that moment has just been conditioned in different than the other one. So it's two different words in the dog.
I mean, I always say this too, in general, to clients, other trainers I'm working with, whatever. I encourage people to whisper during training.
Yeah.
All the time. Because then you're actively teaching your dog to listen for very soft words.
Yeah.
So then you don't have to raise. Right?
Yeah, and the raised voice, if we look at why does that generally work for clients? Because in many circumstances, when the person puts on, they call it their dog voice, right? The dog tends to start listening to them, but it's because when they start doing the dog voice, usually that's when the human means business and they start actually doing what they should be doing to enforce. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Okay.
But it's also true. It's social conflict at the end of the day, right? If you're no da on top of your dog, that's social pressure.
Yeah.
That's technically negative reinforcement. Yeah. And if you put too much pressure on the dog, it goes into positive punishment technically, right?
Yeah, sure.
Right? But because you're screaming at the dog, that's social pressure. It's still negative reinforcement.
Yeah. I wonder though, how much of, and this isn't even worth having because it's subjective, obviously. Some dogs are really fazed by that, social pressure, obviously, where others aren't as impacted by it. So we won't go there, because I was going to say how much of it has to do with the intensity of the voice versus the body language that comes with it and how you're conditioning
all of it combined.
You know what I mean?
Makes a big difference.
So yeah,
right?
for sure. Yeah. So we won't go there. Yeah.
Anyway, this highlights how behavior is not shaped within isolated quadrants, but through fluid interaction of environmental cues, reinforcement history, control types, and contextual learning. Right. So for me, at any point in time, a cue can appear somewhere here. It can be viewed as a timeline or not.
Yeah.
But at some timeline between, say, with the no for the crate thing that we were talking about just now with Michael Ellis, right? Once the dog understands, hey, okay, that's a cue for me to remain here, then it can now access this, right?
Yep.
As an organism's competence grows, so does its ability to detect subtle cue shifts, making strategic behavior adjustments and generalize or discriminate more effectively. At any point during a training regimen, cues may gain or lose predictive value as contingencies shift, sometimes through processes like Pavlovian inhibition, where a cue becomes a signal to signal the absence of an expected outcome.
Yep.
Right. So in competition, it's every time there's a guy with a clipboard walking around, I don't get rewarded.
Yeah.
Right. That's still Pavlovian inhibition.
Yep.
And finally, based on the models presented to the left, the ones we were talking about previously, I acknowledge that cues also exist within gray zones between quadrants, transitional spaces that, when leveraged correctly, can become powerful tools in driving learning and motivation. Mm-hmm. Right. So if I can cue, so out technically is a cue for Premack principle.
Yep.
Right. But it's also a cue for chase the ball.
Yeah.
So I'm literally giving the dog a out. Yeah, out.
Got it. Uh-huh.
If it's trained the way we just said before, right? Whereby out means the quicker you out, the quicker we restart the game.
Yeah. You're doing something to access.
I can literally cue that state in my dog.
Yeah.
Right? Same with what you were saying earlier. If I always negatively reinforce my dog to sit, and then when I release it, fun things happen. Now, break is the cue for fun things to happen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? But that also it gains or it loses value depending on what happens afterwards.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we go back to the bank account situation.
Yeah.
Like I was just saying, just like the out cue, where letting go of a reinforcer momentarily predicts a chance to earn it again, we can shape negative reinforcement cues to carry the same predictive value. So that's what I was saying. What if we could cheat the system? What if every time I subtract money from the bank account, somehow money is added back in?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, it sounds a bit weird, but what if every time I use negative reinforcement, I'm subtracting from the Pavlovian bank account, then I'm decreasing the value of that cue, right? Or I'm decreasing the intensity of that cue, rather. But what if every time there's negative reinforcement present, I'm adding, right? That's the sort of thought process that's going on there. And when negative reinforcement is embedded early in the mechanical learning sequence, like luring it down, when you're luring it down with, like what I was saying earlier, where the prong collar is in the midst of your luring, right? The removal of pressure becomes not just about relief, but part of the pathway to reward.
Yeah.
So it's a cue. It becomes, like you said, is it just a cue? Yes, but it's a bit more than just a cue. The organism begins to anticipate the payoff through the effort, right? And again, what we were talking about earlier with the negative punishment, positive reinforcement sort of gray zone, these two in 2003 showed that wanting and liking are distinct neural processes. Wanting, dopaminergic incentive salience, from liking, hedonic pleasure, showing that learned cues can fuel high motivation even in the absence of immediate pleasure, right? So it's not so much, that's why I was saying that the missing piece for me was incentivizing the chase, the drive, right? It's not that you like the toy, it's that you want the toy.
Sure.
Right? So again, we move from extrinsic to intrinsic, right? And the dog doesn't just learn to escape, avoid pressure, it begins to want the opportunity to act under pressure because of the learned prediction of future reward.
Yeah.
Right? Whereby if there's no, if the pressure is present, it means something's going to happen. It becomes a cue for something good that's going to happen.
Yes.
I'll answer what you said earlier, whether it's, if you're not just counter conditioning it, we'll get to that in a second. And then this is how I think activation emerges. Is it's not a linear reward mechanism, but as a composite state where motivation, competence, and strategic prediction intersect. The behavior is no longer about avoiding discomfort, but about engaging with effort to unlock a valued outcome.
Yeah.
It reflects wanting without immediate liking, and yet becomes one of the most robust motivators in high drive training. So, and all this as well, I'd like to say, I think the concept of activation might as well just live in the sports world and may not necessarily be necessary for the classic pet training industry.
Yeah.
You don't need this level of drive for your average pet dog.
Yeah.
You might want to use some of these concepts, but I think where you're really seeing everything sort of explode in this area is in high level sports.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, was there anything else to add just yet on that?
I mean, all that is just we get to this.
Okay. Before we move to that. So your graph you made originally of the intersection between positive reinforcement and negative punishment, right?
Yep.
Makes 1,000,000% sense to me, right? Totally get it, right? Creating the chase, the drive to try to get it further, whatever, right? That, if we were to say, okay, this is the activation, is that intersection between those two things, right? Where the dog obviously knows there's potential for risk, but they're competent that they could access that positive reinforcement at some point. And I'm still going to kind of argue, though, that like these people that are doing activation, these trainers that are doing this activation work with their e-collars, in most circumstance, the e-collar is still doing nothing, and that what's actually happening is you're following that graph. It's the negative punishment and positive reinforcement that's creating the drive, right? And that either one of two things is going on. They're doing literally that, what you just described, and that missing link that you figured out. That is what is actually happening and what's creating all of the drive. And the e-collar is like so low that it's either like non-recognizable to the dog or they've counter-conditioned any potential like aversive response to it where it's just a neutral and really the dog is working off of that intersection between the two things. Or what's happening is the dog is becoming so competent in the behavior that they truly are just using negative reinforcement on top of that intersection. You get what I'm saying? But it's not that my whole thing all along that I've pushed against is that the stim becomes this like aversive and positive thing to the dog. I think that's just negative reinforcement still at play, but because they have such a high level of competency and they've built so much drive due to that intersection that you're describing, you don't see there's less your spectrum of like the fallout and the competency and the aversive stuff. That's just so there's such minimal chance of fallout at that point in using the negative reinforcement.
And that very, very well might be the case.
Yeah.
That might be the case. So for me, I'm not here to argue for, like, I have nothing to gain
of course,
if this exists or not. Like,
interesting conversation.
For me, it's just like, well, if it were to exist, how would it look like, right?
Yeah.
I personally, if I were to follow through with this model, I think that drive thing we talked about is derived from the interplay of negative punishment and positive reinforcement.
Yep.
And then that gets combined with the interplay between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Those two end up adding together, and that creates the activation. Mm-hmm. And then you can use negative reinforcement standard, and you can use positive reinforcement standard, meaning like it's like levels. Like you can use the 4 quadrants as per usual, and then underneath you can use these whatever 3 new fake quadrants, if you want to say.
Yeah.
That's how I think it would work. We'd have to do experiments.
Yeah.
Because it's still just hypothesis, right? Like no one's done an experiment on it.
Yeah. Right? My thing, and I know this isn't what you're arguing by any means, but my big thing still is just from the conversations that I had, like, it just what doesn't make sense to me is that they're describing like 2 different things. Like he's saying in many circumstances that the aversive sensation, the dog is seeking to, they want the aversive sensation to happen, right? But then on the other side, they're saying it's something that they want to avoid, right? So they're saying it's 2 different things. And like, I think that they're really good at just applying the quadrants of learning to training. You know what I mean? I think they're really, I agree. I think they're just really talented at it, and they're not doing anything drastically different as far as anything other than just applying those quadrants really strategically to create, like they say, dogs that are competent in what they're doing and with heart and soul, right? I think they're very competent at doing that. But where they lose me and where I go, this is kind of bullshit, or it feels like kind of bullshit, is when they start saying that it's doing something different than that, right? As opposed to.
So for you, what would it have to happen for you to be like, okay, accept this activation?
Yeah. This is a great question, right? So, what would have? This is a good question because like I just don't think. I don't know.
So would there, like, that's why I said, like, maybe we need to do experiments.
Yeah.
Would there actually, if someone showed you that there's a distinct reaction between using this, if it exists, versus using just negative reinforcement, would that prove it to you?
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is if there was a way to have virtually the same dog, right, and train that dog doing one of 3 things. One, either just training the dog with, because a lot of these dogs, keep in mind that you're seeing with the crazy drive, they already have that drive. They're already just really well-bred, very motivated dogs. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So what I'm arguing is that in many of these cases, either those dogs just with positive reinforcement and negative punishment would be, I would want to see the result of that. I would want to see the result of pairing positive reinforcement with traditional negative reinforcement, like a sensation that's actually aversive to the dog, right? And I would want to see a dog that's trained with positive reinforcement and a level of negative reinforcement that easily can be overshadowed by the positive reinforcement. Does that make sense, that third one that I just described? Right. So a level that maybe initially is slightly aversive to the dog, but whatever you're having them work for is so motivating that they get past it really quick. Right. Like they very quickly, they start ignoring it. It's like, it's not that aversive where I care that much about it. Right. Because I'm trying to access this thing so much. And then obviously the one where they are actually averse by the negative reinforcement applying, and then the one without any negative reinforcement at all. And I would want to compare the difference between all 3, because what I think is that what will happen is the first one, just positive reinforcement and negative punishment, is going to look virtually identical to the third one I described, which is like a moderate level of aversion that they learn to avoid, further solidifying my claim that the aversive that you're applying is doing literally nothing, right? And then I would want to see the one with the true negative reinforcement implemented with the positive reinforcement, and I would want to see which one's better, right? Which one turns out better?
Which one turns out better?
Which one heeds better results than at that point?
I'm asking. That's why I asked better. It's like, is it better or is it maybe the
more
word
driven,
should be different?
Yeah, maybe probably a different word, right? Like maybe know, like. Okay, so because that would solidify to me one of two things. Like, so if for whatever reason, I wish I had this written out in a graph so I don't have to keep saying it because it's going to confuse me now every time I do it. But okay. So let's say we got 3 different results from those 3.
Sorry to interrupt you. If you want, we can.
Well, I mean, it's fine. I could speech this out pretty easily, I think. Okay.
Cool.
So let's say they all heed 3 different results, right? Like let's say we had an identical dog we were able to clone somehow, right? And each one heeded different results, both just positive reinforcement and negative punishment, traditional negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement, and then mildly aversive but easily overcome negative reinforcement with positive reinforcement. Let's see all 3 heeded different results. I would be, and the third of which heeded better results than the other 2. Then I would be able to confidently say, okay, something you're doing with this, like the stimulation is neither neutral nor is it aversive to the dog, because we already have one where it is aversive and we already have one where it's non-existent or neutral, right? So that would prove to me that it is, in fact, doing something. You get what I'm saying, right? There is something more at play then. But if the other two, if that one was exactly the same as the one without any stimulation, then I would say that it's bullshit. You're either just using traditional negative reinforcement or you're using just positive reinforcement at that point. I think that's the best way I could describe what I would need to see in order to kind of.
How would you qualify better?
I don't necessarily know, right? Because again, we would need basically the same exact dog, right? Or we would need a large enough study of okay, we did this, each example did it with 50 different dogs or something, and 75% of them all came out this way, or 80% of them all came out this way, where we could get some type of average.
But that's the problem though. It's what? Sure, you'll get an average. But what are we quantifying? How would we say? Sure, we can say these aspects
right?
of the study show that this is different.
We would have to study competency, obviously, right? So to use your words, obviously, we would probably have to study whatever. I'm no fucking scientist, right? You know more about this than me, but a lot of people will utilize cortisol and things like that to study. You would have to figure out a way to study the competency of the dog as well as the attitude of the dog, right? I think however we could study both of those things, we would want dogs that are performing, which ones are performing more competently and which ones that are performing more competently have better attitudes about it. We would need to figure out, I don't know how you do it, obviously, but you would need to figure out a way in order to study both of those things, I would think.
It's not an easy study, but let me pose this to you. If we could make a study that shows that a dog, no, probably not, wouldn't pass the ethics boards. We'll do it on humans, let's say.
Yeah.
Because through this research, I've sort of come up with different analogies that sort of help me explain this. So, for example, if you are tired, let's start again. Let's say you go to the gym, right? You're active in going to the gym, you go often, et cetera, et cetera. The more you go, the more you're putting yourself directly in an aversive sensation, but coming through it the other side, right?
Sure.
And you see the value in doing that. So you put yourself in that situation actively to gain whatever it is you're gaining out of it, right? Now, you train yourself so that when you're tired, being tired is the cue to just put your shoes on and leave. Isn't that like proactive negative reinforcement? Like the idea of actively putting yourself in the face to shut off an aversive.
Sure. Yeah. And I think I discussed this in the follow-up episode that I did to Kiba's thing, where we were using the example of UFC fighters that hit themselves before they go into combat, or things like that. It doesn't make it less aversive though. It's just we are as humans are able to make deeper correlations, I feel like, in some circumstances than dogs are able to, where I could look so far into the future of like the results this is going to heed for me, where I could accept the potential aversive in that moment, not because it instinctually starts feeling really good for me to do it. Like, still, when you work out and you're tired, it doesn't feel good, but I could have that forward vision where it overshadows that aversive in that moment because I know what it's going to lead to, right?
Mm-hmm. But you're still putting yourself in the arms of the aversive.
Yes.
Actively.
Sure, yeah. You are absolutely willingly putting yourself in that situation. The other example I used is like if you go get a vaccine, right? Like you know that's going to fucking hurt when they stick that needle in your arm. Nothing about the potential benefits you're going to get from that vaccine are going to make it hurt any less when that needle gets stuck in your arm. But because you could comprehend and correlate these like big future things or things that may or may not happen at that point, you're able to willingly put yourself into that situation. But again, it doesn't make it less aversive to you, right? So I don't even necessarily know if that would even fall into, it wouldn't even fall into quadrants because it's like, it's not like it's negatively reinforcing anything. And it's not that it's really positively, well, I guess you could say it's positively reinforcing a little bit, right? The results in the future, it is a positive reinforcement of getting that aversive sensation in your arm, but
especially in the terms of the gym, for example, right?
Sure. Yeah. But I still, I don't know. I just wonder, like, is that just because of our reasoning abilities as humans? And do dogs really have that capacity to dwell into some of those things as deeply as we do, you know?
I'm still sort of like in the middle, right? It's like, well, if the outcome is the ability, like what I was saying earlier, right? It's like if everything is sort of combined, right? The cue for negative reinforcement is combined with the ability that you will chase something that you might or might not catch, which is, in this case, sorry, you're going to use the word even though I don't want to, activating you to chase something, right? If it's a cue that something is going to happen whereby your dopamine is just going to spike immensely for something, then aren't you still proactively putting yourself in a negative reinforcement situation, so to speak?
Well, let's use the example of the gym, right? So I think another reason why it wouldn't work with dogs, or it doesn't work that way with dogs, is because it's such a future consequence of that action that it would be impossible to classically condition it with an animal that wasn't able to, like, you weren't able to literally have this conversation about, you know what I mean? Like the result of working out, the benefits of working out literally happen fucking, 7 months into the future when you look shredded and awesome on the beach, right? So like, yeah, for you could classically condition that result. You know what I mean? Where with dogs, it's too far. You know what I mean? It's too far to make that correlation.
So classical conditioning, we speculated it's like 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds or something like that, right? Between a cue and something occurring for it to be classically conditioned, right?
Yeah, I think initially, something like that. And then obviously it could be spaced out further, but well, actually, no, I think it's further because, like, in Skinner's book or Pavlov's book, like they did studies where it was way longer than that.
Right, but that's an isolation.
Sure.
He did punishment studies where, like, a conditioned punisher could be given to an animal 40 minutes later, and he would still, quote unquote, understand what it was for.
Correct.
In isolation.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, for sure.
Now, in a training environment, so for example, and you tell me if this makes sense or not. Because I've been playing around with the concept just to see if it works or not. Not necessarily, like, just with different tools. I tried it the other day with I've been trying it with flat collar with so flat collar, mini pop on the flat collar towards me with a jackpot marker at the same time, and they receive the jackpot when they are, let's say, in a heel, right? So I tap them, lure them, move back, lure into the heel, and they receive it.
Yep.
That's all happening in 1.5 to 2.5 seconds. And then because they already know the heel, They already know how to come into it, all this stuff. The more I just do this, the leash pop becomes the prediction for this behavior.
Yeah, it's the cue.
Right?
It becomes heel.
That's the cue.
Yeah.
Right. Becomes heel. But I can also do that with my fronts.
Sure.
So that the dog comes in quicker on the front. Right. So it's not just a.
But it would have to be a different. You know what I mean? Like it would have to be like a different direction, or like you couldn't say that. Okay, well, this pop right automatically becomes the signal to do 4 different things at once. Right. There would have to be some type of other component, at play that's giving the distinction that like a pop in this direction means this, a pop in this direction means this, a pop in this direction means this. Right.
See, I used to think that, but so...
how would they differentiate? If it's exactly the same, how would they differentiate between the two?
So I have a trainer buddy here in Barcelona. He studied with Nino. And so let's say he'll have his dog between his legs and he'll like, let's say this is the dog like this. Where's the camera? Right here. So he'll knee the dog that way. Dog will come into heel on let's say on the right side, right?
Yep.
But he can also do that same movement and do this, and then now the dog is orbiting around him.
Yeah, but
right?
I mean, I've watched plenty of their videos before, and with them kind of doing all their moves and stuff. There's got to be at least a remotely different. So that knee pop to heel, or that knee pop with like a shoulder turn or something. You know what I mean? Like, there's got to be some additional component at play, or else like they would never be. If it's exactly the same thing, they would never be able to differentiate. But it's just
That's what I thought until he told me he just says the word at the right time. Meaning,
so you're saying he pairs the knee pop with heel, or pairs the knee pop with orbit or around or whatever?
Yep.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. They're 2 different things.
Correct.
Right?
So in this case...
So if he just popped with the knee, right, and he said 0 word, the dog is going to then probably
offer the last one that he trained.
Exactly. The strongest of the 2 then at that point, right?
Right.
So that's what I'm saying.
But so if we tie that back to using a negative reinforcement tool with strongly paired cue for reinforcement, especially if it's drive-based reinforcement, with the cue for the behavior, isn't that then negative reinforcement turning into behavior? That is not just...
Yeah, I get where you're going. I would disagree that knee pop is negative reinforcement. I would say
no. Forget the knee pop, but like if that's the same mechanism,
or right? Like the stim. If we're saying the stim with the command at that point, right? This is again exactly the point I've been making all this along, is that stim it turns into just a cue. It's neither aversive nor positive to the dog, or maybe as you've described, right? We could say it exists on that spectrum, right? And it's either a little positive or a little negative, right? Depending on how much we withdraw or put into it, right? But I would look at that no different than, okay, we could say the stim is a cue, right? We could say the word is a cue, right? And they're predicting an outcome, so they could access some type of reinforcement to, whatever. I would look at that as no different than like, my dog knew English and German, right? He had 2 commands for the same behavior, right? I would look at the stim as one command and the verbal as another command. I wouldn't look at them as...
The stim as one command and the verbal... Explain that.
Well, so I mean, like the knee, use the knee pop as an example, right? But let's say the knee pop was stim, right? So the knee pop means, let's say you just taught the knee pop to mean getting into the heel position, right? Let's say you just taught that, right? The knee pop would be a command, and then the word heel would be a command, right? But the knee pop combined with the command is not adding to the command. It's just you're giving 2 you're giving 2 cues at once. It's like if you could say 2 things at the same time. It's like if I said, plots and then down at somehow both of those words came out at the same time in my mouth, right? I would argue it would be the same thing, and the dog would just hear whichever one's more dominant.
Got it. But if within a cue you have also contained within it the emotional state,
sure,
then can't we then still argue that they are separate in terms of quadrant behavior outcomes?
If we're going off of what you described of like they have a bit of an emotional context to them, are you getting back to again your deposit, like let's say that cue a little bit more positive or a little bit more negative, right? We could say that they provide a different negative a more negative or a positive to the dog in that moment, right? But I would say that's more derived from what precedes it than what's happening in the moment, right? The positive or the negative association to that cue is determined through the conditioning of what generally happens after it, right?
What generally happens after it. But if you mark,
yeah,
like for example, like what you were saying earlier, you have a cue that predicts when the pressure is going to be released, right? Sure. But you can also have a cue when the pressure is going to start. You can have cues for all these intermediary points,
and they all predict something, though. That's what I'm saying.
Correct.
Right?
But if you mark the exact moment where the dog is actively fighting against negative reinforcement intrinsically, couldn't you then create that state on cue?
Where they're fighting negative reinforcement.
So like the example I gave last time where it's like dog is in the down, you pull with the leash and they say, nah, I'm downing, right? The opposition reflex stuff.
Yeah. So that would be, again, in that, we talked about that one last time, obviously. That would be, you're just further reinforcing down then at that point, right?
But aren't you also further reinforcing fighting negative reinforcement?
Well, that was the whole point last time, was like it becomes intrinsic, not extrinsic then. I wish I could remember exactly the way that we talked about it last time, but it's either then like where's the pressure turning off, right? The pressure is turning off when they're in the down still, right? So if the pressure is turning off when they're in the down still, you're just reinforcing down still. They're not fighting pressure, they're turning pressure off by downing still, right? Because they would have to be motivated enough by it in order to want to escape or avoid it. And if what we're saying is that we're applying something that the dog is motivated by to want to escape or avoid, but they're staying in the down position, right? They're fighting that pressure then at that point. They would have to be more motivated to down than they would be, whatever we're providing to get them to do the down. I'm assuming at this point, if we're using negative reinforcement to try to get them to fight it, right? We're giving some type of positive reinforcement. That positive reinforcement would have to be stronger than that negative reinforcement, and they're working still just for the positive reinforcement, right?
Yeah, no. Like what we talked about last time, right? If you start paying for effort, it's intrinsic, and then you don't necessarily have to pay it anymore.
Sure.
Right. There's an intersection point where, you pay it because you're paying the behavior of fighting the leash pressure.
So they're intrinsically reinforced by downing, right? So same deal. That Correct. Intrinsic reinforcement of downing is stronger for them than the negative reinforcement you're applying. So you're teaching them to ignore that pressure, right? You're neutralizing it to them. Or they're just shutting down. Or they're just shutting down and they're realizing that they're helpless to the pressure that's happening in that moment.
Well, technically no, because they're fighting to remain. They can't be helpless to it. They're actively choosing to engage more in the behavior.
They're actively trying to stay in the down, right? To either access the reward there, right? Or to turn off that negative reinforcement then at that point.
Right. But like if you keep going, what's the limit of that? How much could you actually get out of a dog if you train that over and over and over again and increase, technically you could take it to the moon and back if you wanted to, right? You could just make a dog super strong against leash pressure.
Then it wouldn't be something they want to avoid anymore.
My point. So what was his name again?
Kiva. Yeah, he said they want it to happen then at that point.
They want it to happen, right?
So then what are they like waiting for the pressure to turn on before they down? You know what I mean? Like this is where you got to describe it a little bit more clearly then at that point. Because we could say then at that point they want it to happen, right? So they would be downing to access the pressure then at that point if they want it to happen, which that just doesn't make, unless you're going to explain that in a way that makes sense.
That doesn't make sense. So if contextual cues also have prediction error, right? Meaning, I'm on the training field, right? And the dog knows we train XYZ behaviors in this training field. Now, if the base cue is negative reinforcement, isn't that turning the dog into the behavior?
Say that one more time.
I think I didn't come out right. If contextual cues are always present under Pavlovian conditioning,
and when you say contextual cues, can you elaborate on that real quick for me?
Environment.
Got it. So like even when I'm in this field, I feel a certain way, or things like that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Got it.
Even this jacket, like if I'm working with my dog, my dog knows that this jacket is the jacket I have the treats in. Usually.
Understood. Yeah.
Sure. Not necessarily true because I always hide stuff in my pants and stuff like this, just so they never fully. You know.
I understand what you're saying though. Yeah. Okay, so those are always present.
Yeah, those cues are always present. Mm-hmm. And now the dog understands. Okay, we're going to be doing these exercises, right? It's waiting for you to apply that negative reinforcement stimulus cue for stuff to start.
Sure.
Yes, no.
Yeah, I would just not call it negative reinforcement, right? You're applying a cue, right? And you know, that cue means to do something, but you know, this is where I get into like, is it an aversive or is it not an aversive, right? Like we could say, yeah, like it is aversive and it's cueing them to do something, right? Like, and that's, yes, negative reinforcement then at that point, but they're looking at it in the bigger picture of like, oh, okay, cool, this is aversive and I want to avoid it, but like, I still get fun things on the back end in the hot hands game. And you know what I mean? Like we put ourselves into certain places of aversion because of potential alcohol, right? But like, it's still aversive, right? Is the big picture of what I keep coming back to is the sensation is still aversive. That doesn't mean it's detrimental to the dog, right? But it is still aversive to them in that moment, right?
So for you, tell me if I'm wrong. For you, for this whole activation thing to work, I know you've said it already, but the next thing for you would be if we could show that it's not aversive?
Well, if we could show that it's not aversive, then it would be no different than any other command to me, which would mean that we've successfully counter-conditioned it from being aversive, right?
Okay, fair enough. So then how does that fit in? Like, how would it have to fit in for you where it's aversive?
This is the point I'm making, right? And this is why I had Kiva on, is because I was like, I'm not the one that needs to prove, you know what I mean? Like, I just like, all roads lead back to like, you're using it as an aversive or you're counter conditioning it and using it as a command, right? That's where all roads lead back to for me personally, right? And what I'm saying is that they're disagreeing with that, right? They're saying that's not the case. It's not. There's something else, right? And I'm saying, all right, what is it? Right? And it's just like, nobody's able to explain it, I feel like. And so far, you have been the only one that's been able to like put together something that even remotely can come close to explaining it. But still, to me, and I understand you're not trying to be the like, yeah, knee po is fucking real. You know what I mean? Like the activation is 100% certainly real. But you're obviously diving into this a little deeper and trying to ask more questions of like, can it be? Right?
Yeah.
But like, that's why I keep saying, like, I don't know. Like, I'm not the one who needs to bear the proof, or whatever the statement is from it. I just like every time it's described to me, it just leads back to one of those two things, right? Is what they're doing, which is why I said that test that I'm describing would be able to determine, is there an outcome difference between using it as an aversive, using it as a counter-conditioned aversive, or is it just playing zero role in things?
Okay. So you would argue that if it's a counter-conditioned aversive,
then we could start to have a conversation that if there's a difference, if it was an aversive at one point and we counter-conditioned it to be non-aversive to the dog at that point, and somehow there was a difference in outcome with the dogs at that point, then I would say, all right, we could start to talk about this a little bit. Let's figure out why that might be the case, right?
Let's backtrack a bit. So for you, dopamine spikes, moving away from cortisol is not enough to clarify that it's not aversive.
You're gonna have to dumb that down a little bit more for me right there.
So if you mentioned earlier, like we'd have to use like cortisol studies, et cetera, right?
Or whatever, right?
Now,
like I pulled that out of my ass. Whatever they use to study the whatever. Yeah.
Classically, we've used cortisol in scientific studies to demonstrate stress
sure.
and aversive perception.
Yeah.
There's a big debate whether that should be the case or not, because cortisol as well as dopamine play like weird functions together. Dopamine also works in your fight or flight response. So you might as well be seeing a dopamine spike because of the aversive anyway.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's why I'm asking, like, for you, it's not enough to see just a scientifically proven dopamine spike at the cue to signify that it's not aversive. Along with the body language of the dog.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we probably could go off of a cortisol spike as well as just looking at the dog to say, is the dog averse to this or not?
Okay. So then it's a cue with negative reinforcement with a perceived aversive that's been counter conditioned to mean what? Nothing, zero, neutral, or positive.
Yeah, so I would feel like if we took something that was aversive and we counter-conditioned it and said, okay, the dog either has a neutral association with this thing or they have a positive association with this thing, then at that point, that it would just then turn into either, if it was a neutral association, something that you could pair with something else, right? So a cue, right? Or if it became a positive, something that we could then use as either positive reinforcement or negative punishment then at that point, right? So we could withhold it or apply it. But that was the question I asked Kiba, where when he was telling me like, hey, like, oh yeah, I turned the stim into something the dog wants to access. And then I was like, okay, well, why would you applying the stim then make the dog do a behavior if you already gave them the reward? If they have the reward, why would they be driven to then do something else, right? You would then technically need to apply that on the back end. That would be your reinforcement for the behavior. And then again, I don't think he really had much of an answer to that. So that's, again, what I'm saying is once it's counter-conditioned, it, in my opinion, would either become just a cue, right? And if it became just a cue, it would be no different than just training without the e-collar and saying positive reinforcement, negative punishment, right? Or, again, one more time, if it became a positive, then if somehow applying that positive continuously prior to the outcomes, right? The dog doing the thing, then we could start to say, all right, it's activate. It's doing something that they would consider activation if, again, we were heating different results out of it, right?
Got it.
But that's what I'm saying. Like, I can't really, it's hard to say like, oh, I need to see this or I need to see that, because it's like, in my brain, those are two things that could be very easily, like, I could say that and like there's not too much debate to either of those things that I said there then at that point, right? But the difference is they're trying to debate there's something else, right? And we could have hypothetical conversations about it all day long, but until they explain exactly what's happening, right? We're going to find ourselves almost in this trap we're kind of getting ourselves into.
Exactly.
Kind of just circling around it a lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. You know what I mean? It's a very interesting conversation. And like I said, like everything you just outlined, like there's a lot, forget the activation side of things. Some of the things you brought up just of like cues and cues existing on a spectrum and stuff like that is very interesting and something like, all right, cool. Like we could work with that a little bit. We could dive a little deeper into that, stuff like that. And like I said, that's the closest thing anybody's ever pitched me that's been like something a little more out of the ordinary than, what, traditional, behavior is training or whatever, I still think there's probably some areas we could still say it's still, and you're not suggesting it's something totally different, obviously, than learning theory, but, there's a bit more of a spectrum to it than what's being suggested. But as far as the activation side of things, I'm still not seeing it, if you will. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was also skeptical when I first heard it too, and I was like, well, but they just can't be that these very high level trainers are all talking about it.
I know.
There must be something there.
See, that I agree with you. It doesn't make sense why so many of them would be like preaching so hard towards a certain thing, aside from the fact that
it's marketing.
It's a marketing, which is the other thing that I said all along. It's a way to make using e-collars seem nicer.
So I have if I had one bias, it would probably be that. So the only bias I would have for finding if this whole thing is true would be so that we can make the use of aversives legit again.
Yes, of course. And again, that
would be the only bias.
I'm also not arguing. I've argued for a million times that I think that they're applying things in a better way than most people. You know what I mean? Like, they're clearly getting awesome results. The debate has never been, are they getting good results or not? You know what I mean? Like, they're extremely, extremely talented trainers, right? That's my biggest holdup with it. Is like, man, like, you're marketing this particular thing though that doesn't really make sense, unless explained, unless explained under the context of like making the use of them nicer. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think if they were like just flat out, if they said, well, we want you guys to find the use of these tools useful in some way.
Or just like, hey, we have a way to use these tools in a way that creates less stress than other people, right?
Fair enough.
Like, hey, we're implementing these tools in a way that creates less stress than how other people are doing it. And it's because of the formula of how we're putting things together. Hell yeah, totally get it, right? That makes complete fucking sense to me too, right? But again, that's not what they're saying. They're saying it's something different. So, I don't know.
We'll have to do that. I guess the conclusion is we'll have to do the studies.
Yeah, right.
See if it is really different. And in the meantime, I guess something we can all glean from this is if they are getting good results, let's try, generally speaking, if we're going to be using aversive tools or any tool for that matter, because I mean, the principles are still the same.
Yeah.
For whatever tool you're going to be using, let's try to use the techniques these people are talking about.
I won't disagree with that at all either. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and see if it doesn't make our training better. Sure. And if then we all start doing it, we're like, wait, it does make a difference. Like, not empirically, like we would like it to be empirical in the sense of having studies. Yeah. But at least observationally, if more people are like, well,
dogs look bad.
It doesn't work, right? Yeah. Or no, it doesn't work. It's just bullshit.
Yep.
And we can be like, okay, no, let's not even study it.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, I'm with you on that. Yeah. I'm for sure with you on that. You know what's something I don't know the answer to, which I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because I actually do got to hop off here in just a little bit. Back when I was in the sport world, and I don't have any bearing to this other than what I was told, was that there were a lot of people saying that a lot of that camp did not produce as high of level as competitors in the sport world as some of the other camps, though. So I don't know.
When you're saying camps, you're referring to the Nabopo camp or what?
Correct. Yeah. Like that versus Ivan versus Michael. Like, so basically, like a lot of this was a long time ago, but at the time, and this might have even been a biased opinion by some of the people that I was training with, right?
Fair consideration. Yeah.
But there was very few people from the Napopo camp that were like very high level competitors in certain areas of the sport world. Now, that being said, I don't know what Bart's specialty is or was as far as like titles on his dogs and stuff like that, but maybe more of them are more involved in like the K. I think they're a little bit more involved in maybe like the KNPV stuff.
Yep, he did a lot of Belgian ring stuff as well. Yeah.
So I almost should just like retract what I just said because it's just total like gossip.
Yeah, fair enough.
But yeah, so I actually am curious to know though also like how many people like Napopo trainers have, you know, like what kind of stats they have as far as like titles and stuff are concerned.
I wish I had like immense amounts of money and I could just go take Ivan's course, then his, then like so I could at least compare and contrast them, right? Because it's like what tends to happen is you go to one school and you're like, well, this is it.
Yeah.
I learned everything.
One of these days, I do want to take one of them. I'll tell you, I'm one that like I have no problem spending a decent amount of money on a decent amount of things. I really struggle with like I don't want to act like I know everything because I don't, right? But like I feel like I know enough of the general concepts of like the TWC stuff where I feel like I'm so scared that I would be severely disappointed spending $10,000 to learn maybe one or two small things. You know what I mean? I'm very scared of that, honestly. I wish there was a more affordable way of being able to to get some of these answers to like things that I see the graduates talk about online a lot. You know what I mean? But like kind of, for better choice of words, gatekeep a little bit. And vice versa.
Like,
you know what I mean? Like, and vice versa with Bart and all that and the Napo Post stuff. It's just, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm generally speaking, that's why I commend Michael so much, because he didn't give a fuck about, oh no, this is my training strategy. He's just like, well, here's all the videos.
It's very accessible.
And like,
nothing's
if he finds out something new, he's going to tell you about it.
Yes. Yep. For sure.
Right. If we would like the furthering of dog training as a whole, it would be nice if these camps could also just be like, yeah, cool. Look, this is how this stuff works.
Yeah.
Take it.
Yeah. For sure.
And you might be right. They might not have nothing. They might not have anything new that might change the world. You know,
it sounds like dickish because like I'm like Ivan is a way smarter person than me, right? Like I know that. Like I'm not even like there's no question of that in my opinion. Like he's a way more educated, knowledgeable, and competent dog trainer than I ever will be, right? Like that's fine, right? So there's going to be a million things I can learn. The difference is I feel like I don't know how much of it would directly apply to the work that I'm doing, where it's like, is me spending $10,000 on his course, am I going to see that big of a return on that investment in my own work that I'm doing? I don't know. And I have a hard time justifying spending that money without knowing that. You know what I mean?
Right. And you can justify a lot of things. It's like, well, now my name's tied to Ivan, let's say, and now I can make more money because of it too.
Yeah.
It's an option. Josh, do you have any thoughts on this whole thing?
No, I'm just soaking it all in.
Soaking it in.
Yeah.
From your perspective, which we've talked about at the beginning, you have an understanding now of dog training. That's
you know everything
good.
about it, right?
No, you know everything.
Oh, God.
What are the quadrants of learning? Josh?
No, we're not doing that.
No. But to you, does this stuff, like could you see it making sense, and would it make a difference to you from your perspective?
Yeah, Josh, give us your take.
No,
because at the end of the day, sorry to interrupt that. Like at the end of the day, if this whole thing is just a marketing ploy, so we can use tools, then let's see it. Like I want to know the people who aren't working with dogs every day but understand about dogs, if they see a value in it or not, right? That's why I'm asking you, Josh. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're good. I don't know. I think the thing that really got me was the the gambling example, because I have such an addictive personality, so I definitely understand. Like, I'm up $600. I should just leave, but I should have a dopamine high because I'm up here, but the risk of maybe getting more, but knowing that I could lose it all easily, that's like where I sit, and that's why I don't gamble a lot, because I'll just throw it all away.
I was thinking about that as we were going on this conversation when you brought up the gambling thing, and a part of me also feels like it's not even the losses, it's the fact that I feel like a gambling personality, like I know myself, right? Like this is crazy. Like after we've been to Vegas a couple of times, right? And I lost maybe in total, I don't know, a couple $1,000s in my life, right? I did the math though, like after this last trip of like lifetime, that's how I came up with like a couple $1,000s. I did the math of total lifetime losses in gambling that I have, because my brain, I'm very addictive too. And this is why like I got to be careful when I go places like that, because I will be able to look at things on such a bigger picture where I don't look at it in the moment. If I sit down at the slot machine and maybe I lost $300, right? I look at it more of like, well, over the course of the next 5 times, maybe I'll earn it back, right? So I'm still working solely off of the potential dopamine rush of winning. And because I look at it bigger picture, those individual losses that I hit don't feel as punishing to me, because in the big picture of things, I'm able to be like, oh, well, that's not going to be a loss in the end of the day.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there's been studies based off of like classical conditioning stuff where it's like, well, if you are addicted to sex, if you're addicted to food, if you're like whatever the addiction is, how in control are you of that addiction.
Yeah.
And it turns out the studies mostly show like, no, even though you think you are in control, it's very, very likely you're not.
For sure.
Like all these processes are going on very deep inside your brain, and you think you're in control of grabbing the ice cream or not grabbing the ice cream. But because it is this ice cream, you just go and grab it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
But like it makes sense to me that there's maybe like there's like a third spot there in the middle of you know, these hard points that we have, because I'm just trying to like put myself in that situation. I'm like, yeah, it makes sense. Like right there is kind of a sweet spot for me. And it kind of made me think when we talked about the quadrants, you know, episodes ago.
Which ones were those?
I don't know, but there's so many now. But
there's so many. Yeah, look at what you did. You added too many.
Yeah, but no, there's we kind of made like a point graph. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like we had the
sure.
And it was like, oh, this scenario is
where we started
like
placing things on it. Yeah.
And I feel like that's almost like a correlation to like what we're talking
That's
about.
exactly it. It's the spectrum within them.
Yeah.
Right. So we placed them on different ends of it, and it's like they didn't fit all evenly. Of like this is right smack in the middle of positive reinforcement. It was still positive reinforcement, but it was like a more subtracted dollar sign version of it. You know what I mean? A withdrawed version
in
of
our Pavlovian bank. See.
Right? So yeah, I guess that can be a big takeaway from today is seeing some of those things as a bit. Like it's still, again, I still feel like it still fits within the things. But it's you know, there's a little bit more wiggle room to it, if you will.
Yeah, I think it might be something that's easier to mold and like show a client a little bit better. Yeah, maybe.
Oh, I wonder if clients are really up for like, oh, there's 4 and there's like these in between the 4 and it's a bit lot, like it's a lot of stuff. I'd love if we could find like a cohesive way of explaining all this stuff in the most sort of fact, just digest it, done.
Well, if I know you off of now our like what this is our 5th hour of conversing with each other, or 6th hour of conversing with each other, I feel like you will probably put something together kind of like that after this conversation. And you will continue to stew on this and be able to digest it. You know, some of my vomit as well as your points.
We'll see we'll see everything in 3 months.
I'll expect a PowerPoint presentation in my email by next Friday.
Well, good challenge accepted.
Oh God!
Right. No, this is cool. Like I said, I gotta hop off here. This has been a great conversation. I think that this will, as we said last time, probably warrant another one that we'll do. I am interested. I will try to pull up that the safety training study where we can maybe, because that might tie into this a little bit actually.
Yeah.
I'll have to pull that up, and then I am interested to maybe get a little bit more into the weeds of, we started really diving into the differences between positive punishment and negative reinforcement in that spectrum, and like what defines which one to the dog and stuff. I am interested maybe to put some thought to that and see if maybe we could find some resources that might allow us to discuss that a bit more clearly. I think that would make a very interesting conversation as well.
If you want, what we could do, because we didn't do this last time, I can send you all the references and you can put them in the description for the people, because I saw like a couple of people ask for references and stuff. And then we can look at those as well. There's tons of literature between the like prediction error stuff between negative punishment and positive reinforcement. There's tons of research there. It's probably why a lot of the positive only people are so heavy about it. It's because it's been shown to work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. No, I like this. This is, like you said, this is the closest to kind of explaining what they're going for. Because when
it's just looking deeper into it.
Yeah, when we had Kiba on, I mean, it was a great conversation, but at the same time, it was just like, yeah, this is my way. Okay. You know, and there wasn't really a dissection, I guess. And yeah, you're a madman. The whole like thing. I mean,
appreciate it.
It was very well put together and thought out, and it was the best like representation of, I think, what they're going for.
Yep.
That's all I can say, really.
Appreciate it, Josh. Thank you, man.
Yeah, of course.
You got anything you want to add before we turn this off?
No, just thank you once again for the opportunity to come on here and chit chat, man.
Yeah.
That's it's such an honor, honestly. I think, like, going back to the Michael Ellis thing, I am by no means completely right about all the things we just talked about. I'm just sharing, like, what I think could be useful information.
Yeah.
And to have a platform to do that, aside from the usual platforms I have, which are my Instagram, my YouTube, etc., to be able to talk face to face with you, because otherwise it's just me spitting into the universe, like most dog training happens these days.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't want to add to this whole PR thing.
Yep.
Like, oh no, it's my method, your method, this method's wrong. It's like, no, let's all learn.
Yep.
And so to be able to have the platform to be able to do that for me is a super honor.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank
For
you.
sure. Happy to have you on. We will we'll talk here over the next week or so. And like I said, we'll definitely set up another one. We'll keep these going.
Yeah.
All right. We'll see you soon.
See you, man.
Take it easy, man.
See ya.